Hey guys, tonight we are embarking on a rather grand and somewhat mysterious expedition. Not down the familiar, well-trodden paths of Rome or Greece, but further south following the majestic, life-giving course of the Nile River deep into the heart of ancient Africa. Imagine yourself, if you will, leaving the colossal temples and bustling cities of pharaonic Egypt, behind your gaze fixed on the southern horizon towards a land of shimmering desert sands, rugged granite outcrops, and the whispers of a powerful, often enigmatic indigenous kingdom. Tonight, we are journeying to the ancient kingdom of Kush, a civilization that flourished for over a millennium in what is now modern-day Sudan, to explore its curious customs and its rather peculiar and sometimes quite stern methods of maintaining order. Now trying to successfully navigate ancient Kushite society without a fluent grasp of the Meroitic language? Good luck with that, as it remains largely undeciphered. A profound and healthy respect for their formidable lion-headed gods and a keen intuitive understanding of precisely when not to accidentally offend a powerful ruling Kandake or a group of particularly stern-looking temple priests. Your chances of a completely peaceful, entirely uneventful, and socially seamless tour would be, let's just say, subject to some rather sudden and possibly quite peculiar divine or royal adjustments to your itinerary. It was a land of unique rules and potent traditions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're joining our sleepy caravan from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your imaginary voyage begins Algeria, where the familiar splendors of ancient Egypt, the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, gradually give way to a different, though no less compelling landscape. As you travel south along the Nile beyond the traditional southern border of Egypt at Aswan, and the formidable First Cataract, those rocky, rapid-strewn stretches of the river that made navigation so challenging, you enter the ancient land of Nubia. This is a region of stark beauty, the fertile ribbon-like green valley of the Nile, often incredibly narrow, squeezed between vast, arid deserts of golden sand and dark volcanic rock to the east and west. The sun beats down with an intensity that makes the Egyptian sun feel like a gentle spring morning. The river itself, the lifeblood of this land as it was for Egypt, carves its path through rugged granite jebels and sandstone cliffs, its waters reflecting a sky of almost impossible clarity. This is the territory that gave rise to the powerful and sophisticated indigenous African civilization known as the Kingdom of Kush. A mainstream historical fact is that the Kingdom of Kush was a major ancient African civilization located in Nubia, flourishing for over 1,000 years broadly, from around the 8th century BC to the 4th century CE in its well-known Napatan and Meroitic phases, though its cultural roots stretch much further back into antiquity with the earlier Kerma culture from around 2500 BCE. This kingdom had a long, complex, and often intertwined relationship with its powerful northern neighbor Egypt. At times, Kush was a trading partner, a source of exotic goods like gold, ivory, ebony, and incense for the pharaohs. At other times, it was a subject territory controlled or heavily influenced by Egyptian imperial power. And in one particularly remarkable historical reversal, Kushite kings conquered Egypt and ruled as its 25th dynasty of pharaohs, the Black Pharaohs, for nearly a century, from around 744 to 656 BCE, leaving an indelible mark on Egyptian history and art. Ancient Kush isn't just some vague, ill-defined spot on a dusty old map that might be labeled, "Here be very large crocodiles and possibly some extremely stern warrior queens." Oh no, it was a real, thriving, influential, and often quite powerful kingdom in its own right. Think of it as Egypt's sophisticated, culturally distinct, and occasionally rather assertive southern neighbor, the one that sometimes borrowed Egypt's double crown for a century or so just to see how it fit, and as it turned out, wore it rather well. Yet for all its historical significance and its impressive archaeological remains, the steep-sided pyramids of Meroe, the grand temples dedicated to both Egyptian and indigenous Kushite gods, the intricate gold jewelry, and the distinctive pottery, the Kingdom of Kush often remains more enigmatic, more shrouded in mystery than its more famous Nilotic counterpart to the north. A key reason for this enduring enigma is its unique written language, Meroitic, which flourished especially from the 3rd century BCE onwards. The Kushites developed their own alphabetic script derived in part from Egyptian hieroglyphs and Demotic to write their language. And while we can read the Meroitic script in the sense of knowing the phonetic values of most of its signs, the Meroitic language itself remains largely undeciphered. We can recognize names of kings, queens, and gods, and understand some basic grammatical structures, but the vast majority of their inscriptions, their historical annals, their religious texts, their detailed accounts of laws and customs, if they wrote such things down extensively, remain silent to us. The Kushites, it seems, left behind this beautiful, intriguing Meroitic script, which we mostly can't translate with any real depth or certainty. It's as if they meticulously wrote down all their juiciest state secrets, their most peculiar and character-defining punishments for social transgressions, their best recipes for sacred hippo and date stew, and then with a knowing smile locked the diary and casually tossed the only key into the deepest part of the Nile. Very inconsiderate, really, for future sleepy history enthusiasts like ourselves, who are desperately trying to understand their curious customs. The precise extent of direct Egyptian cultural and religious influence on the developing kingdom of Kush, particularly during its Napatan and later Meroitic periods, versus the strength, resilience, and continuity of deeply rooted indigenous Nubian traditions and innovations, remains a dynamic and often keenly debated area of ongoing research and scholarly discussion among Nubian specialists and Egyptologists. It was clearly a complex interplay, a fusion of imported ideas and powerful local creativity, resulting in a civilization that was both recognizably Nilotic and uniquely Kushite. Our journey tonight, Egeria, will be an attempt to peer through these veils of time and linguistic silence, to piece together from the archaeological evidence from the often biased accounts of their Egyptian, Greek, and Roman contemporaries, and from careful comparative study, a picture of some of the curious customs and peculiar punishments that might have characterized life in this ancient African kingdom by the Nile. We'll be exploring how they governed themselves, how they worshipped their gods, a fascinating blend of familiar Egyptian deities like Amun and Isis alongside their own formidable local gods like the lion-headed Apetimak, how they honor their dead with those distinctive steep-sided pyramids, and yes, how they might have dealt with those who transgressed against the established order of their society. The land of Kush itself was a source of immense wealth. Its gold mines were legendary, providing much of the precious metal that adorned the temples and tombs of both Kush and Egypt. It controlled vital trade routes that brought ivory, ebony, incense, animal skins, and live exotic animals from the heart of Africa northwards to the Mediterranean world. This strategic position and its natural resources made Kush a significant player in the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world. A kingdom worth knowing, worth respecting, and as we shall see, one with a rich and often quite unique set of cultural traditions. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the ancient Greeks and Romans often referred to Kush, or the broader Nubian region, with a mixture of awe, respect, and exotic fascination, sometimes calling it Ethiopia, a term that in antiquity was applied much more broadly to lands south of Egypt, inhabited by dark-skinned peoples, not just the geographical area of modern Ethiopia. Classical writers spoke of its fabled wealth, its powerful rulers, especially those formidable warrior queens, the Candaces, whom we will certainly meet later, its reputedly long-lived inhabitants, and its supposedly unique and pious customs, sometimes even suggesting that the gods themselves favored these distant, sun-blessed people. So prepare yourself, Egeria, to journey south up the Nile into a land of ancient power, profound mystery and traditions that are waiting to be gently, sleepily rediscovered. The jewel of the Nile beckons. You are drifting southwards, Egeria, on the timeless, life-giving current of the mighty Nile, leaving the familiar, if still ancient glories of pharaonic Egypt far behind you. The landscape has become starker. The desert pressing closer to the riverbanks, the granite outcrops more formidable. You are venturing deep into Nubia, that fabled land of gold and powerful indigenous African kingdoms. And before we can truly appreciate the later, more famous phases of Kushite civilization, the Napatan pharaohs who conquered Egypt or the iron-working queens of Meroe with their steep pyramids, we must journey even further back in time to witness the very dawn of centralized power in this region, to explore the rise of Kerma Kush's first major urban and political center, a truly remarkable and often overlooked Bronze Age civilization. A mainstream historical fact is that the Kerma culture flourishing from approximately 2500 BCE to around 1500 BCE centered around its capital city, also called Kerma, located south of the third cataract of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, represents the first major urbanized Nubian kingdom. This was not some primitive backwater or a mere colonial outpost of Egypt. Kerma was a powerful independent African state with a highly developed, distinct material culture, a sophisticated social hierarchy, and at times considerable military might. That posed a genuine threat to its northern Egyptian neighbors. Imagine yourself Egeria arriving at the site of ancient Kerma during its heyday, perhaps around 2000 BCE. The heart of the city is dominated by an extraordinary structure unlike anything you would have seen in Egypt, the Western Defufa. This is not a stone pyramid or a rock-cut temple, but a colossal, solid mud brick edifice rising perhaps as high as 60 feet or more from the surrounding plain. Its battered walls giving it the appearance of a small man-made mountain. The Western Defufa at Kerma is this absolutely massive, almost monolithic mud brick structure. It's like the ancient Nubians decided to build themselves a bona fide skyscraper, but their primary building material options were limited to Nile mud, a bit of straw, and a very, very strong belief in the architectural principle of bigger is almost certainly better and definitely more impressive to visiting dignitaries. Modern architects and archaeologists are probably still trying to figure out precisely how it hasn't just gently melted back into the desert floor after more than 4,000 years of sun and occasional wind. Its exact purpose is still debated by scholars. It was likely a combination of a royal palace, a major religious temple dedicated to local Nubian deities, and an administrative center, a potent symbol of the Kerma king's power and his connection to the divine. Atop its flat roof, rituals would have been performed visible for miles around. Surrounding the Defufa is a bustling city with residential areas, workshops for skilled artisans, and perhaps a harbor on a nearby channel of the Nile. The people of Kerma were master craftspeople. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the absolutely stunning quality of their pottery. Kerma potters produced some of the most beautiful and technically accomplished ceramic ware ever made in the entire Nile Valley, often considered even finer and more delicate than contemporary Egyptian pottery from the Middle Kingdom period. Their signature style is an incredibly thin, highly polished, red-brown ware with a distinctive black top and interior often shaped into elegant tulip beakers or bowls. The precision required to achieve that sharp, clean color division during the firing process is a testament to their exceptional skill. You can almost imagine the slightly exasperated Egyptian potters downriver upon seeing a shipment of this exquisite Kerma ware arriving via trade. Right? That's it. Their pottery is becoming annoyingly, almost supernaturally good. We'd better get the pharaoh to authorize the construction of a few more intimidating military fortresses down here in Lower Nubia, just in case their ceramic superiority starts giving them any uppity political ideas. And Kerma certainly did give Egypt some uppity political ideas, or rather, presented a significant challenge. During Egypt's Middle Kingdom, and particularly its politically fragmented Second Intermediate period, the powerful kings of Kerma were major rivals. They controlled lucrative trade routes, funneling gold, ivory, ebony, incense, cattle, and enslaved people from further south in Africa into Egypt. They launched military campaigns deep into Egyptian-controlled Lower Nubia, sometimes even threatening Upper Egypt itself. The Egyptians, in response, built a series of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile in Lower Nubia like Buhen and Semna to control these trade routes, extract resources, and defend their southern border against the formidable warriors of Kerma. The society of Kerma, as inferred from its archaeological remains, was clearly socially stratified. This is most dramatically evident in their burial customs, particularly in the vast eastern cemetery at Kerma. Here, the rulers and elite members of society were interred in enormous circular earthen tumuli, some of them up to 300 feet in diameter. These were not simple graves. The central burial chamber of a king would be richly furnished with an abundance of grave goods, exquisite pottery, bronze, weapons, imported Egyptian luxury items like faience beads and stone vessels, jewelry of gold and semi-precious stones, and vast quantities of sacrificed animals, especially cattle whose skulls bacrania, were often arranged around the perimeter of the tomb in a striking display of wealth and ritual power. But the most arresting, and to our modern sensibilities, deeply unsettling feature of these royal Kerma burials is the clear evidence of human sacrifice or retainer sacrifice on a massive scale. Within the largest tumuli, archaeologists have found the remains of hundreds of other individuals, men, women, and children, buried alongside the king. They appear to have been sacrificed at the time of the ruler's funeral, presumably to accompany him, serve him, and attest to his power in the afterlife. The precise nature and full extent of this practice of human sacrifice in the royal Kerma burials, whether these numerous retainers were dispatched willingly as part of a deeply ingrained religious belief system that promised them continued status, or even a form of divinity in the next world, or if they were forcibly killed, and whether this incredibly dramatic practice was consistent throughout the entire millennium of the Kerma period, or perhaps confined to specific reigns or particularly powerful rulers, remains a subject of intense archaeological investigation, complex interpretation, and unavoidable ethical discussion among scholars of Nubian history. Being a highly favored royal retainer in the court of Kerma clearly came with some truly excellent perks. Proximity to power, a share in the kingdom's wealth, perhaps even a rather fancy tomb eventually, but also that one rather significant, non-negotiable, and distinctly career-ending downside clearly listed in the job description under other important duties as may be assigned upon the occasion of royal demise. It probably made for some very, very nervous job interviews for the coveted position of Chief Royal Cupbearer, or Guardian of the King's favorite ostrich feather fan. The Kerma culture, with its unique blend of indigenous African traditions and selective adoption of certain Egyptian influences, particularly in some aspects of iconography and luxury goods, laid the crucial foundations for the later Kushite kingdoms of Napata and Meroe. It established a long and powerful tradition of Nubian statehood, a legacy of sophisticated artistry, and a complex, sometimes contentious relationship with its northern neighbor Egypt. The echoes of Kerma's power, its distinctive material culture, and perhaps even some of its core beliefs about kingship and the afterlife would continue to resonate down the Nile Valley for centuries to come, shaping the civilizations that followed in its mighty, if sometimes rather shadowy footsteps. The rise of Kerma was the true dawn of Kushite power, a distinctly African voice beginning to make itself heard with formidable strength along the banks of the sacred river. The mighty mud brick edifice of the Western Defufa at Kerma, Algeria, and the surrounding city with its highly skilled artisans and its rather unsettling royal burial customs have given you a profound, if somewhat shadowy glimpse into the earliest phase of centralized Kushite power in ancient Nubia. You've seen how this indigenous African kingdom flourishing from around 2500 to 1500 BCE was a significant force in its own right. A frequent trading partner and at times a formidable military rival to its northern neighbor pharaonic Egypt. But the story of Kush and its intricate dance with Egypt doesn't end with the decline of Kerma. After a period where New Kingdom Egypt extended its imperial domination deep into Nubia, annexing much of the land and heavily Egyptianizing its culture and administration for several centuries, the pendulum of power was remarkably to swing in the other direction, as Egypt itself entered a period of internal weakness and fragmentation known as the Third Intermediate Period. A new Kushite dynasty arose further south, centered around the city of Napata near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. And these Napatan kings, deeply imbued with Egyptian religious and royal traditions, from centuries of contact would achieve something truly extraordinary. They would turn the tables, march north, and conquer Egypt itself, ruling as its legitimate, if ethnically Nubian, 25th dynasty of pharaohs. Imagine the scene: Algeria, sometime in the mid-8th century BCE. Egypt, the ancient land of pyramids and sphinxes, the civilization that had for so long considered itself the pinnacle of earthly power and divine order, is now politically divided. Its rulers weak, its traditions perhaps seen by some devout outsiders as having become decadent or impure. Meanwhile, down south in Nubia, in the Napatan Kingdom of Kush, a line of strong, ambitious rulers is emerging. These Kushite kings see themselves not as foreign barbarians, but as true champions of Egyptian tradition, particularly the pure worship of the great god Amun, whose cult was immensely powerful in both Thebes and Upper Egypt, and at their own sacred site of Jebel Barkal, which they considered a southern primeval home of the deity. So, after centuries of Egypt often being the dominant power, casting its long shadow southwards over Nubia, the Kushites basically looked north and thought, you know what, it seems our northern neighbors are having a bit of a messy internal disagreement. and aren't quite upholding the glorious traditions of Amun with the appropriate level of pharaonic vigor. Perhaps it's time for some new management. And with that, they began their remarkable journey to become the Black Pharaohs of Egypt. The Kushite march north was not a sudden impulsive raid. It was a gradual consolidation of power, culminating in the campaigns of kings like Kashta, who first extended Kushite influence into Upper Egypt, and then most famously his son Piye, sometimes called Pian-Ki. A mainstream historical fact is that the Kushite kings from Napata methodically conquered a fragmented Egypt in the mid to late 8th century BCE and ruled as its 25th dynasty for nearly a century, from approximately 744 to 656 BC. These pharaohs, including notable rulers like Piye Shabaka Shebitku and the Great Taharka, embraced many Egyptian royal and religious traditions, presented themselves as restorers of order and piety, while simultaneously maintaining and celebrating their distinct Nubian identity and heritage. King Piye in particular left behind a magnificent granite stela. His victory stela, which provides a detailed, if undoubtedly biased from his perspective account of his conquest of Egypt. It's a fascinating document, framing his military campaign not just as a power grab, but as a divinely sanctioned pious mission to restore unity and true religious observance in the northern lands, all under the Blagosklonost. Favor, though I'll use an English equivalent for the sleepy narration of Amun. Reading Piye's Stella Egeria is like delving into the ultimate ancient, I came, I saw, I conquered, and by the way the gods totally think I'm awesome monument. It's pages and pages of meticulously inscribed hieroglyphs detailing, and then I, Piye, beloved of Amun, proceeded to this city, and its ruler wisely submitted and offered me many fine horses. And then I sailed to that city, and they foolishly resisted for about 5 minutes, after which they also submitted and offered me even more and even better horses. My horses, by the way, were also very happy and well-fed throughout this entire righteous endeavor. It's a masterpiece of royal self-promotion piety and perhaps just a little bit of equine enthusiasm. The precise motivations behind the Kushite conquest of Egypt under Piye and his successors, whether it was primarily driven by straightforward imperial ambition and a desire to control the vast resources and trade routes of Egypt, or if there was a significant element of genuine religious zeal, a belief that they were restoring true piety and order to a decadent and politically fragmented Egypt in the name of their shared god Amun, or perhaps a complex interplay of these and other strategic factors, continue to be analyzed and energetically debated by historians of ancient Egypt and Nubia. Once in power, these Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty presented themselves not as foreign occupiers, but as legitimate restorers of Egyptian tradition. They adopted the full pharaonic titulary, wore the traditional double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, often with subtle Kushite additions like a double uraeus cobra or distinctive cap crowns and ram-headed amulets, patronized Egyptian temples, and even initiated a renaissance of older Egyptian artistic styles, particularly those of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, which they saw as a more pure and classical period. They undertook significant building projects both in Egypt, contributing to the great temple complex of Karnak in Thebes, for example, and back in their Nubian homeland at sites like Jebel Barkal and Kawa, further solidifying the worship of Amun as a state god of their vast dual kingdom. The image of these Black Pharaohs, as they are often called by modern historians, a term reflecting their Nubian origins, though they themselves would have seen themselves as rightful inheritors of Egyptian tradition, ruling over the ancient land of the Nile, is a powerful one. It reverses the more common historical narrative of northern powers dominating southern ones. It speaks to the strength, ambition, and cultural sophistication of this Kushite dynasty. Imagine the cultural dynamics, Egeria. For centuries, Egyptians had often depicted Nubians in their art as foreigners, sometimes as conquered enemies bringing tribute or as exotic peoples from the south. Now individuals from this very same southern land were seated on the throne of the pharaohs, commanding the allegiance of Egyptian nobles, priests, and officials. Ruling Egypt as a Kushite pharaoh must have been quite the experience. You're in charge of this incredibly ancient, incredibly prestigious civilization with thousands of years of history and monumental architecture all around you. You're overseeing the divine offerings at Karnak, dictating policy from Memphis or Thebes. But you also probably just occasionally miss your mom's home-cooked Nubian millet bread and the familiar rugged landscapes around Napata. Yes, yes, a Kushite pharaoh might muse surveying the vast hypostyle hall at Karnak. The divine offerings here are indeed splendid, the hieroglyphs most eloquent, and the sheer scale of it all quite satisfactory. But does anyone around here know how to make a decent bowl of... You know what, never mind. Just bring me another exquisitely carved papyrus scroll, detailing how magnificent and divinely favored I am, and perhaps a small side of those rather tasty Theban dates. The reign of the 25th dynasty, however, was not destined to last indefinitely. A new formidable power was rising in the Near East, the mighty and often quite ruthless Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, with their powerful iron-equipped armies, began to push westwards and southwards, eventually clashing with the Kushite Egyptian forces in Palestine, and then invading Egypt itself. Pharaoh Taharka, one of the most powerful and significant rulers of the 25th dynasty, a great builder who is even mentioned in the Old Testament as Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, Kush, in connection with events in Judah, fought valiantly against the Assyrian advance. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Taharka's extensive building projects both in Egypt and throughout Nubia, including impressive temples and colonnades, demonstrate the scale of his ambition and the considerable resources still commanded by the Kushite pharaohs, even as the Assyrian threat loomed. Ultimately, however, the Assyrian military machine proved too strong. After several campaigns, the Assyrians under kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal succeeded in driving the Kushite pharaohs out of Egypt by the mid-7th century BCE. Taharka's successor Tantamani made a brief, unsuccessful attempt to reclaim Egypt, but was also defeated. The Black Pharaohs were forced to retreat southwards back into their Nubian heartland. Their direct rule over Egypt was over, yet the legacy of the 25th dynasty was profound. It had demonstrated the power and vitality of the Kushite kingdom on an international stage. It had fostered a period of artistic and religious revival in Egypt. And even after their withdrawal from Egypt, the Kushite kingdom, now centered further south, first at Napata and later at Meroe, would continue to thrive for another 1,000 years, developing its own increasingly distinct and fascinating culture, a story we shall soon explore. The brief but glorious reign of the Kushite pharaohs over Egypt remains one of the most remarkable and unique chapters in the long, intertwined histories of these two great Nile Valley civilizations. The glorious, if ultimately rather brief, reign of the Kushite Black Pharaohs over Egypt has come to its end, Egeria. The formidable military might of the Assyrian Empire with its iron weapons and relentless campaign strategies proved too much even for valiant Kushite rulers like Taharka. By the mid-7th century BCE, the 25th dynasty was forced to relinquish its control over the northern kingdom and retreat southwards back into its Nubian heartland. Their Egyptian adventure, that remarkable period of ruling as legitimate pharaohs from a southern Nubian power base, was over, probably accompanied by a rather firm suggestion from the Assyrians, along the lines of, "Thank you for your service in restoring traditional Egyptian piety, gentlemen. Now, if you wouldn't mind, please collect your sacred rams and your rather impressive collection of double uraeus crowns, and don't let the Assyrian war chariot hit you too hard on your way back up the Nile." This retreat, however, did not signify the end of Kushite power. Far from it. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new, vibrant, and increasingly distinct phase of their civilization. Over the subsequent centuries, the political and cultural center of the Kingdom of Kush gradually shifted further south from Napata, which lay just below the Fourth Cataract and was perhaps deemed too vulnerable to northern aggression, or possibly facing environmental pressures like desertification. The new heart of Kushite power, the new capital, would rise in a region known as the Island of Meroe, a fertile grassland area situated between the Nile, the Atbara River, and the Blue Nile, roughly between the 5th and 6th cataracts. The precise reasons for this southward shift of the Kushite capital from the Napatan region to Meroe, and whether it was a gradual, centuries-long transition, driven by evolving trade routes and resource availability, or a more definitive strategic move prompted by specific political events, economic opportunities, or pressing environmental challenges like the desiccation of the Napata region, are still complex questions actively discussed and meticulously researched by archaeologists and historians specializing in ancient Nubia. Whatever the exact impetus, by around 300 BCE, the city of Meroe had become the undisputed capital of a flourishing Kushite kingdom, ushering in what we now call the Meroitic period, which would last for another 600 to 700 years until roughly 350 CE. And Meroe Egeria was no mere provincial backwater. It became a bustling, sophisticated urban center, a hub of industry, a nexus of long-distance trade, and the crucible of a unique Kushite culture that, while still retaining some echoes of Egyptian influence, increasingly asserted its own indigenous African identity. One of the most defining characteristics of Meroe, and a key to its prosperity and power, was its mastery of ironworking. A mainstream historical fact is that the city of Meroe became a major center for iron production in sub-Saharan Africa during its heyday. Vast slag heaps. The telltale waste products of extensive iron smelting have been found by archaeologists at the site, earning Meroe the rather evocative moniker of the Birmingham of Africa. The region around Meroe was rich in iron ore and, crucially, had sufficient acacia woodlands to provide the charcoal needed for the demanding process of smelting. This ability to produce iron on a significant scale gave the Meroites a distinct advantage. Iron tools would have improved agricultural productivity, allowing them to support a larger population. And iron weapons, spearheads, arrowheads, swords, would have equipped their armies, giving them a military edge in a world still largely dominated by bronze. The air in certain districts of Meroe, you can imagine, probably had a permanent, slightly metallic tang, a faint scent of burning charcoal, and the rhythmic clang of hammers from smithies shaping this strong, versatile metal. A really good high-status first-date gift in Meroe was likely not a delicate bouquet of desert flowers, but perhaps a beautifully crafted razor-sharp iron spearhead, or a set of particularly well-balanced agricultural implements. Very practical, very Meroitic. Meroe's strategic location also made it a vital hub for trade. It lay astride important routes connecting the Mediterranean world via Egypt and the Red Sea, with the vast, resource-rich lands of sub-Saharan Africa. From the south came gold ivory, ebony ostrich feathers, leopard skins, live exotic animals like giraffes and monkeys, and enslaved people, all highly prized commodities in Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Meroe controlled much of this lucrative northward trade, acting as a crucial intermediary and deriving considerable wealth from it. In return, luxury goods from the Hellenistic and Roman worlds flowed south into Meroe, fine pottery, glassware, wine, and amphorae metalwork, and other manufactured items. The marketplaces of Meroe would have been vibrant, cosmopolitan places filled with merchants from distant lands. The babble of different languages and the exotic sights and smells of transcontinental commerce. This period also saw the flourishing of a distinct Meroitic culture. While the earlier Napatan rulers had heavily adopted Egyptian hieroglyphs for their monumental inscriptions and embraced many aspects of Egyptian religious iconography, the Meroites increasingly developed their own unique forms of expression. Most significantly, they created their own alphabetic script known as Meroitic cursive, and a more formal hieroglyphic version used mostly for temple inscriptions. This script, with its 23 signs, was derived in part from Egyptian Demotic, but it was used to write the indigenous Meroitic language. So the Kushites at Meroe, having perhaps grown a little tired of trying to make their own distinctly non-Egyptian language fit comfortably into the rather complex straitjacket of Egyptian hieroglyphs, essentially said, "Right, this is all very nice, but it's time we had our own cool, streamlined alphabetic writing system, much more efficient for recording important things like royal decrees, temple inventories, and perhaps the king's weekly shopping list for exotic incense and slightly aggressive war elephants." Fantastic, a true innovation. Except, as we've lamented before Egeria, while we can now read the Meroitic script in the sense of knowing the phonetic values of most of its letters, the Meroitic language itself remains largely undeciphered. We can often sound out the words, but their precise meanings beyond names of people, places, and gods, and a few basic grammatical elements mostly elude us. It's like being handed an incredibly important historical document detailing all the secrets of a lost civilization, but it's written in a secret code that only they, and possibly a few exceptionally well-educated ancient Nubian giraffes, ever truly understood. The frustration is immense. Meroitic art and architecture also developed their own distinctive styles. While Egyptian influences certainly continued, particularly in temple design and religious iconography, a more pronounced indigenous African sensibility emerged. You see it in the depictions of royalty, who are often portrayed with darker skin, fuller features, and specific Kushite regalia and jewelry. Their pyramids, which we will explore in more detail later, are much smaller, steeper, and more numerous than their Egyptian counterparts, often with a distinctive offering. Chapel attached to the eastern side, giving them a unique architectural signature. It's like they looked at the colossal Giza pyramids and thought, very impressive, very monumental. Undoubtedly a triumph of ancient engineering and resource allocation. But can we perhaps make them pointier? And maybe a whole lot more of them, but smaller, and perhaps with a more convenient attached gift shop for afterlife essentials. The city of Meroe itself would have been an impressive sight. A sprawling urban center with grand temples dedicated to both the widely revered Egyptian god Amun, and with increasing prominence indigenous Kushite deities like Apedemak, the powerful lion-headed warrior god, and various local goddesses. There would have been royal palaces, extensive residential areas for its diverse population, bustling workshops for artisans, and those crucial industrial zones for iron smelting. And surrounding the city, the distinctive cemeteries with their clusters of steep-sided pyramids, the final resting places of Meroitic royalty and nobility. It was here in the southern capital that the formidable ruling queens, the Candaces, or Candaces as they are known, from Greco-Roman sources, often held sway, a fascinating aspect of Kushite society we shall certainly delve into later. Meroe's might built on iron trade and a unique cultural synthesis ensured that the Kingdom of Kush remained a significant independent power in Africa for many centuries. The bustling iron-rich city of Meroe, your new Kushite capital, Egeria now stands as a testament to a vibrant, independent African civilization, a hub of transcontinental trade, and the center of a unique cultural synthesis. You've imagined its temples, its palaces, its workshops, ringing with the sound of hammers shaping iron, and its marketplaces alive with exotic goods from the deep south and luxury items from the Mediterranean world. But how was this powerful kingdom actually governed? Who held the reins of power, and by what peculiar ancient customs was that power transferred from one ruler to the next? As you delve into the enigmatic world of Kushite royalty, you'll discover that their methods of royal succession were often far more complex and perhaps more intriguingly nuanced than the straightforward father-to-eldest son primogeniture that characterized many other ancient monarchies. In the Kingdom of Kush, the ruler, the king, or Kor, a Meroitic title, was much like the Egyptian pharaohs to the north, considered a divinely sanctioned figure, an intermediary between the gods and the people, responsible for maintaining cosmic order, though they would have had their own term for it, and ensuring the prosperity of the land. Their authority was immense. But how did one ascend to this lofty, ram-headed, amulet-adorned position? It wasn't always as simple as being the previous king's eldest boy, automatically inheriting the fancy hat and the keys to the royal treasury. Becoming king in Kush often involved a fascinating interplay of divine will, priestly influence, strong maternal connections, and perhaps even a degree of elective consensus. It was like a very high-stakes, divinely overseen job application process, where the candidates weren't just submitting their resumes on clay tablets, but were also being closely scrutinized by the great god Amun himself, who apparently had very strong opinions on who should be wearing the Kushite crown. So tell me, candidate number 3, who appears to be my esteemed nephew twice removed on my mother's particularly influential side. Amun might be imagined to telepathically inquire via his chief priest, "Why do you believe you are uniquely qualified to be the next ruler of this fine Nilotic kingdom? Chief guardian of my sacred gold-plated rams and principal insurer. Of adequate annual Nile flood levels. Please be specific, and try not to mention your rather unfortunate incident with the sacred beer at last year's Opet festival." A mainstream historical fact gleaned from classical Greek and Roman writers who commented on Kushite affairs, often with a mixture of fascination and sometimes misunderstanding, as well as from Kushite royal inscriptions, particularly from the earlier Napatan period. Though these traditions likely had enduring influence, is that the selection or legitimization of a new king often involved a significant role for divine oracles, especially that of the supreme state god Amun, whose main cult center in Nubia was at Jebel Barkal near Napata. This sacred mountain was considered a southern home of the Theban Amun. According to writers like Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian of the 1st century BCE, though he was often reporting on much earlier traditions when a Kushite king died. The priests of Amun would, through oracular pronouncements supposedly delivered by the god himself, select the successor from among a group of eligible royal kinsmen, perhaps the deceased king's brothers, sons, or nephews. The god, it was believed, would indicate his choice, perhaps by causing his cult statue to nod or move in a particular way when the names of candidates were presented. This divine election gave immense legitimacy to the chosen ruler. The precise mechanisms of Kushite royal succession, particularly the exact balance of power between the pronouncements of divine oracles, the actual influence wielded by the powerful priesthood of Amun, any underlying matrilineal considerations passed down through the Queen Mother, and whatever elective or consultative rights might have been held by other members of the royal family, leading nobles, or even military commanders, remains subjects of intense scholarly investigation and ongoing interpretation, as the surviving textual and iconographic evidence is often fragmentary, open to multiple readings, and sometimes filtered through the potentially biased perspectives of external classical observers. Adding another layer of fascinating complexity to Kushite succession is the remarkably prominent and powerful role played by royal women, particularly the Queen Mother, who often held the title of Candace or Candace as Hellenized by Greek and Roman writers. This title could refer to the king's mother, but some Candaces also appear to have ruled as queens, regnant in their own right, a topic we'll explore more fully later. In the context of succession, the Candace, as the mother of potential heirs, likely wielded enormous influence. Some scholars have suggested strong matrilineal undercurrents in Kushite society, where eligibility for kingship, or at least a significant claim to it, might have been traced or strongly reinforced through the maternal line. The Queen Mother, therefore, wasn't just quietly knitting royal booties in the palace's private quarters. Oh no. She was a formidable political force, a kingmaker, or perhaps more accurately, a core maker, her support and approval often crucial for a candidate's success. You can almost imagine her a woman of immense dignity and sharp political acumen addressing the royal council or the assembled priests. Yes, gentlemen, that particular candidate for the kingship is indeed very brave in battle, possesses an admirable collection of gold earrings, and can recite the 72 sacred names of Apadamak backwards. But more importantly, does he diligently eat his greens? And even more crucially, does he unfailingly listen to his wise and experienced mother? These, sirs, are the truly indispensable qualifications for effective rule, wouldn't you agree? A particularly quirky and rather dramatic, if historically debated, tidbit regarding the immense power of the Kushite priesthood in these royal affairs comes once again from Diodorus Siculus. He famously claimed that in earlier times, likely referring to the Napatan period, the priests of Amun at Napata held such absolute sway over the kings that they could, if the oracle so decreed, even send a message to the reigning monarch commanding him to commit suicide, thereby ending his reign if the god deemed it necessary. The king, bound by piety, would supposedly obey. Diodorus then recounts how a later, more Hellenized Kushite king named Ergomenes, often identified with Archimani Warmus around the 3rd century BCE, when he received such a divine memo, suggesting his timely demise, rather audaciously decided he wasn't quite ready for the afterlife. Instead, he supposedly marched to the temple with his soldiers, had the meddlesome priests massacred, and thereby reformed the system, freeing the monarchy from such extreme priestly domination. While the literal truth and precise details of this rather sensational story are debated by historians, it vividly illustrates the perception, at least among some classical observers, of the extraordinary power once wielded by the Kushite religious establishment in the selection and even the unselection of their divinely appointed rulers. It was a rather firm unsubscribe from all future divine suicide suggestions policy, and probably a very smart career move for Ergomenes. Once a new king was chosen, whether by divine oracle familial consensus or some combination thereof, his accession would be marked by elaborate coronation rituals. These often still involved a journey to the sacred precinct of Jebel Barkal at Napata, even if Meroe was the primary political and economic capital. There, in the great temple of Amun, the god would once again, through his priests and oracles, formally confirm his choice, bestowing upon the new ruler the divine legitimacy and sacral power necessary to govern the kingdom of Kush. This ensured that the new king, regardless of how his candidacy emerged, was seen by his people as the true divinely ordained shepherd of the Nubian land. ready to uphold its traditions and lead it to prosperity under the watchful gaze of Amun and the fierce protection of the lion god Apetamak. The intricate and often divinely guided process of Kushite royal succession has now been unveiled to you, Egeria. You've seen how the path to the throne in Napata or Meroe wasn't always a simple matter of hereditary right, but could involve the pronouncements of powerful oracles, the significant influence of the Queen Mother or Kandake, and perhaps even a degree of consensus among the ruling elite. The King the Kor, once chosen and consecrated, ruled as a sacred figure, a vital link between the Kushite people and their powerful, often rather imposing array of gods. And it is to this divine realm, this unique Kushite pantheon that blended familiar Egyptian deities with formidable indigenous African gods, that we now turn our sleepy, curious gaze. The religious landscape of ancient Kush was a fascinating tapestry woven from centuries of interaction with Egypt, combined with deep-rooted local Nubian beliefs. It wasn't a simple case of importing Egyptian gods wholesale and setting them up in Kushite temples. Rather, it was a dynamic process of adoption, adaptation, and syncretism, resulting in a religious identity that was uniquely Kushite. The Kushite religious scene was like a truly spectacular, divinely catered, international potluck dinner. Egypt, the venerable elder statesman of Nilotic civilizations, brought its famously popular Amun-Ra casserole, still warm from the temple kitchens of Thebes, and perhaps some elegantly crafted Isis-themed finger sandwiches with a hint of magical mystery. Kush, the proud southern host, then contributed its own spectacular homegrown Apetamak lion god chili. Very spicy, incredibly powerful, guaranteed to put hair on your chest or at least on your divine lion mane, and most definitely not to be trifled with by the faint of heart. And somehow all these divine dishes coexisted, sometimes blending flavors, sometimes standing distinct, ensuring every Kushite from the king to the humble farmer found something or someone to worship. At the very top of the borrowed deities, at least in terms of state importance and royal patronage, stood the mighty Amun. A mainstream historical fact is that the Kushite kingdom, particularly during its Napatan period, and continuing into the Meroitic era, adopted the Egyptian state god Amun, often syncretized with Ra as Amun-Ra as their own supreme deity. The sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal near Napata was considered by the Kushites to be a southern primeval home of Amun, perhaps even his birthplace, and they built a magnificent temple complex there in his honor, rivaling some of the great Amun temples in Egypt itself. We've already seen how Amun's oracle at Jebel Barkal played a crucial role in legitimizing Kushite kings. His iconography in Kush often mirrored that of Egypt, the ram-headed sphinxes, the tall twin-plumed crown, but sometimes with subtle Kushite stylistic variations. Isis, the great Egyptian mother goddess, renowned for her magic, her devotion to her husband Osiris, and her role as protector of the dead and of children, also found a fervent following in Kush. Her cult was immensely popular throughout the Nile Valley and the wider Roman world, and Kush was no exception. Temples were dedicated to her, and Kushite queens, the Kandakes, often seem to have had a particularly close association with her, perhaps seeing in Isis a divine model for their own powerful maternal and regal roles. Osiris, her resurrected husband and lord of the Egyptian underworld, and their son Horus, the falcon-headed god who represented rightful kingship, were also part of this imported Egyptian divine family that found a comfortable home in Kush. But the Kushites were far from mere cultural copycats. Alongside these powerful Egyptian deities they revered, and increasingly promoted their own indigenous Nubian gods, who became particularly prominent during the later Meroitic period, a time when Kushite culture asserted its unique identity with growing confidence. Chief among these was the formidable Apetamak, the lion-headed warrior god. Apetamak was a truly Kushite creation, a powerful, often rather fierce deity associated with military victory, royal power, and perhaps the wilder desert regions that flanked the Nile Valley. He was often depicted as a lion-headed man, sometimes with multiple arms or even 3 lion heads brandishing weapons or holding prisoners, a clear symbol of Kushite strength and martial prowess. Temples dedicated to Apetamak, such as those at Naka and Musawarat es Sufra in the Butana region south of Meroe, showcase a distinctly Meroitic architectural and artistic style, often featuring vibrant reliefs of the god in his leonine glory, sometimes accompanied by ruling kings and queens making offerings. Imagine trying to explain to Apetamak that multi-armed, triple-headed in some depictions, at least undeniably fierce lion warrior deity that you accidentally forgot to leave out his nightly offering of freshly hunted gazelle jerky and a large flagon of sacred extra strong millet beer. My sincerest, most humble apologies, O mighty roarer of the southern wastes, guardian of the royal armory. You might stammer, "It's just been a terribly busy week down at the iron smelter, and the chariot wheels needed urgent re-greasing," and he probably wouldn't be overly impressed with your excuses. Best to keep Epidemic well supplied and happy. Other local deities also held sway. Sabu-Makar was another important indigenous creator god, sometimes seen as a divine partner or counterpart to Apidamak. And there were numerous local goddesses, perhaps associated with specific localities, fertility, or particular aspects of nature whose names are sometimes preserved in Meroitic inscriptions, though their exact roles and mythologies are often unclear to us due to the limitations of our understanding of the Meroitic language. The precise relationship and hierarchy between the widely worshipped Egyptian-derived deities like Amun and Isis, and these increasingly prominent indigenous Kushite gods like Apidamak and Sabu-Makar, especially within the Meroitic state cult and popular religion, and how this divine balance might have shifted significantly over the centuries, or varied between different regions of the Kushite kingdom, remain complex and fascinating questions that scholars of Nubian religion continue to explore through detailed iconographic analysis, the architectural layout of temples, and the frustratingly limited textual evidence available from Meroitic inscriptions. The visual representation of these Kushite gods in their temples, on reliefs and in statuary, is a captivating blend of influences. Temple architecture often followed general Egyptian layouts with impressive pylons, colonnaded courtyards, and inner sanctuaries. But Meroitic temples also incorporated unique features, different column styles, and a distinctive artistic sensibility, especially in the dynamic, often more rounded and robust depictions of human and divine figures. When depicting Egyptian gods like Amun Kushite, artists often followed established Egyptian conventions. But when it came to their own indigenous deities like Apidamak, they created a powerful and original iconography that clearly expressed a unique Kushite theological and cultural identity. Having both Amun and Apidamak in your national divine lineup was probably quite good for Kushite international and domestic divine diplomacy. Oh, are those esteemed Egyptian dignitaries visiting from Thebes this week? Splendid, they'll feel right at home in our magnificent Temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal. It's practically a southern franchise of Karnak. And next week, when those rather fierce chieftains from the southern desert regions come to pay their respects and tribute, we'll be sure to emphasize the awesome power and undeniable local street cred of our very own, very fierce, homegrown Nubian lion god, Epidemic. It's all about divine versatility and catering to your audience. Religious practices would have involved daily offerings of food, drink, and incense at the temples, elaborate festivals celebrating key gods or seasonal events, and processions where the cult statues of the deities were carried forth to bless the land and the people. Priests and priestesses, often drawn from elite families, would have wielded considerable influence managing temple estates, performing sacred rituals, and interpreting divine will, a role we've already seen as crucial in royal succession. Pilgrimage sites like the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal or the growing temple complexes dedicated to Apidamak in the heartland of Meroe would have drawn devotees from across the kingdom, all seeking the favor and protection of this unique, syncretic, and powerfully Kushite assembly of gods. You are now becoming deeply acquainted, Egeria, with the divine landscape of the Ancient Kingdom of Kush. A fascinating spiritual realm where the familiar, majestic forms of Egyptian gods like Amun and Isis walked hand in hand, or perhaps paw in paw in some cases, with formidable indigenous Nubian deities, such as the fierce lion-headed Epidemic. You've seen how this unique pantheon shaped royal ideology, with kings chosen by divine oracle and ruling as sacred intermediaries. But where did these powerful gods reside? Where were they worshipped with daily devotion and elaborate ceremony? Your journey now takes you in imagination through the towering pylons and into the shadowy, incense-laden halls of Kush's grand temples by the Nile, to glimpse the sacred rites and priestly secrets that form the very heart of their religious life. A mainstream historical fact is that Kushite rulers, both in the earlier Napatan period and the later Meroitic era, invested enormous resources in the construction and endowment of magnificent temples. Major state temples dedicated to the supreme god Amun, such as those at Jebel Barkal, the Pure Mountain near Napata, considered a southern home of Theban Amun, and Kawa, further south on the east bank of the Nile, were vast complexes often built on an Egyptian model, with imposing entrance pylons, open courtyards, colonnaded hypostyle halls, and a series of increasingly sacred inner chambers leading to the dark, mysterious sanctuary where the cult statue of the god himself resided. Later in the Meroitic period, equally impressive, if sometimes stylistically distinct, temples were erected for indigenous deities like Apetamak, the lion god, particularly at sites like Naka and Musawarat es Sufra in the Butana steppe, east of the Nile. Imagine yourself, Ageria, approaching one of these great Kushite temples, perhaps the Temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal. Even from a distance, its massive sandstone pylons carved with vibrant reliefs of the king. Smiting enemies or making offerings to the god would dominate the landscape, a clear statement of royal power and divine sanction. As you pass through the gateway, you enter a sun-drenched outer courtyard, perhaps filled with lesser shrines offering tables and throngs of ordinary Kushite people bringing their modest gifts or seeking blessings. The air here is alive with the sounds of daily life, the murmur of prayers, the bleating of sacrificial animals. But as you move deeper into the temple towards the hypostyle hall, with its forest of towering, elaborately painted columns, the light dims, the sounds become more hushed, and a profound sense of sacred awe begins to settle upon you. This is the domain of the god and of his dedicated servants, the priests. The daily life within these temples revolved around a constant cycle of ritual designed to honor the resident deity, ensure its continued benevolence, and maintain the cosmic order. Much of what we know or infer about these daily Kushite temple rites comes from comparing their temple architecture and iconography with the far more extensively documented practices of pharaonic Egypt, given the strong Egyptian influence on Kushite state religion, particularly concerning Amun. The core idea was that the temple was quite literally the house of the god, and the deity residing within in the form of its cult statue needed to be attended to with all the care and reverence due to a divine monarch. So each morning, well before dawn, the temple would stir to life. High-ranking priests, having undergone ritual purification themselves, would approach the sealed doors of the inner sanctuary. With prescribed chants and gestures, they would break the clay seals, open the doors, and enter the Holy of Holies, where the cult statue of Amun or Apetamak or Isis stood shrouded in darkness. This was the moment of awakening the god. The priests would perform rituals to symbolically rouse the deity from its nocturnal slumber, perhaps by gently touching the statue, offering prayers and burning fragrant incense. The statue itself, often made of precious wood or stone, perhaps adorned with gold, silver, and inlaid jewels, would then be ritually bathed or purified with lustral water, anointed with sacred oils, and dressed in fresh, fine linen garments and elaborate divine regalia. Being a Kushite priest, you realize, wasn't just about looking distinguished in a pristine white linen kilt or a fashionable leopard skin, a common priestly garment, and occasionally chanting mysteriously in front of a large, impressive statue. Oh no, it was a very busy, highly structured job with a demanding daily schedule. Waking up the god statue at an ungodly hour, meticulously bathing it, and hoping you didn't accidentally chip its sacred golden toenail, carefully dressing it in its divine designer wardrobe, then respectfully offering it a spiritually satisfying breakfast, which conveniently the god would only consume in an ethereal, non-calorific manner, leaving the actual delicious food for the priest to enjoy later. Then, of course, there was lunch afternoon tea, probably with sacred honey cakes, and dinner to prepare and offer. The sheer divine catering demands alone must have been utterly exhausting. And woe betide you if Lord Apetamak had specifically requested freshly hunted, ritually pure gazelle for his main course that day? And all you had left in the temple larder was some slightly past its best sacred barley bread and a few wizened offering figs. Throughout the day, further offerings would be presented to the god. Loaves of bread, jars of beer and wine, cuts of meat from sacrificed animals, fresh fruits, vegetables, milk, honey and flowers, all laid out on offering tables before the shrine. Hymns would be sung, prayers recited, and complex liturgical dramas, perhaps enacted by the temple staff. Processions, where the cult statue of the god was placed in a sacred bark, a boat-shaped shrine, and carried on the shoulders of priests, either within the temple precincts or sometimes out into the city for major festivals, were also a key feature, allowing the ordinary populace a chance to glimpse and be blessed by the divine presence. The priesthood itself was a powerful and often hereditary institution. There was a clear hierarchy from the high priest, who often held immense political influence, as we saw with the oracles in royal succession, down to various ranks of lesser priests. Lector priests who read the sacred texts, singers, musicians, and temple servants. Priestesses also played significant roles, particularly in the cults of female deities like Isis or local Kushite goddesses. These individuals were not just religious functionaries. They were often highly educated scholars, astronomers, healers, administrators of the vast temple estates, which owned land livestock and controlled significant economic resources, and crucially, the guardians of priestly secrets. The esoteric knowledge, the sacred texts written perhaps in Egyptian hieroglyphs for Amun, or in the still enigmatic Meroitic script for local deities, and the precise ritual lore necessary to maintain the correct relationship between the human world and the divine. The inner sanctum of a Kushite temple where the cult statue resided was like the ultimate super exclusive VIP lounge of the ancient Nilotic world. Terribly sorry, commoner, a stern-faced temple guard might intone. This particularly sacred and dimly lit area is strictly for fully initiated high priests, specifically chosen divine incarnations, and occasionally very well-behaved gold-plated sacred rams only. You may, however, enjoy the festival from the slightly less exclusive and considerably more crowded outer courtyard. And please do try not to spill your humble offering of lukewarm barley beer on the sacred pavement. It upsets the god of immaculate temple flooring. The precise nature of the daily temple liturgy and the specific theological interpretations, myths, and esoteric knowledge held by the Kushite priesthood, especially concerning their deeply venerated indigenous deities like Apidema, are areas where our understanding is significantly limited by the undeciphered Meroitic script, forcing scholars to rely heavily on meticulous iconographic analysis of temple reliefs which depict rituals and divine figures. The architectural layout and orientation of temple structures and careful comparisons with the better documented religious practices of contemporary pharaonic Egypt, while always acknowledging the potential for unique Kushite innovations and interpretations. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the fascinating temple complex at Muswarat es Sufra, located in the Butana grassland east of Meroe. This unique and rather puzzling site consists of extensive walled enclosures, numerous ramps, colonnades, and unusual structures, including a famous building, often called the Elephant Temple, due to its depictions of elephants. Its exact function is still debated by archaeologists, but it may have been a major pilgrimage center, a royal hunting lodge, or ceremonial retreat, a place for training or corralling elephants for warfare or religious processions, or perhaps even a kind of sacred zoological park. It certainly doesn't fit neatly into the standard Egyptian temple model and highlights the distinctive character of Meroitic religious architecture and practice. For the ordinary Kushite Egeria, the temple was the awe-inspiring focal point of their religious life. While you wouldn't typically enter the inner sanctums, you would come to the outer courtyards to bring your personal offerings, to make vows, to seek healing or guidance from the god, and to participate in the great public festivals that punctuated the year celebrating the cycles of nature. The power of the gods and the divine authority of your Kushite king or Kandake. The temple was where heaven and earth met, where sacred rites ensured the flow of blessings, and where the secrets of the gods were carefully guarded by their devoted priests. The grand temples of Kush Egeria, with their towering pylons, their shadowy hypostyle halls, and their inner sanctums pulsating with the imagined presence of Amun, or the fierce leonine energy of Apetamak, have given you a profound insight into the religious heart of this ancient Nubian kingdom. You've pictured the daily rites, the priestly secrets, the festivals that bound the community to its gods and its sacred rulers. But what happened when these rulers, these divine intermediaries themselves, passed from the earthly realm? How did the Kushites honor their deceased kings and queens? And what do their unique funerary customs, particularly their distinctive pyramids, tell us about their beliefs in eternity and the journey to the afterlife? Prepare yourself, for we are now venturing into the silent, sun-baked royal cemeteries of Meroe and Napata. A mainstream historical fact is that the rulers of the Kingdom of Kush, across both the Napatan and later more prolific Meroitic periods, were indeed buried in pyramid tombs. This practice, clearly inspired by their long and complex relationship with pharaonic Egypt, was adopted and then adapted by the Kushites to create a funerary architectural style that was uniquely their own. The main royal pyramid fields are found at El Kuru and Nuri near Napata. Used largely by the 25th dynasty pharaohs and their Napatan successors, and most extensively in several large cemeteries surrounding the southern capital of Meroe, often referred to as the North, South, and West cemeteries. But if you're picturing massive Giza-scale structures, Ageria, you'll need to adjust your mental image slightly. Kushite pyramids, while undeniably impressive in their own right, and certainly requiring considerable labor and resources, are generally smaller, and most strikingly much steeper-sided than their more famous Egyptian counterparts. While the Great Pyramids of Egypt have a gentler slope, typically around 51 to 53 degrees, Meroitic pyramids soar upwards at a much more acute angle, often between 60 and 70 degrees, giving them a tall, slender, almost needle-like appearance. They have a smaller base, but achieve a dramatic verticality. It's as if the Kushite architects looked at the colossal, broad-shouldered pyramids of their northern neighbors and collectively thought, yes, very impressive, very wide. Undeniably a statement. But can we perhaps make them pointier? Like really dramatically, almost impractically pointy. And maybe let's build a whole lot more of them, but slightly smaller. More like a dense, highly exclusive, and rather gothically inclined subdivision of elite afterlife residences, each with its own handy little attached gift shop/offering chapel for the convenience of visiting ancestral spirits. These offering chapels are another key distinctive feature. Unlike Egyptian pyramids, where the offering cult often took place in a separate valley temple or mortuary temple complex, each Kushite pyramid typically had a small decorated chapel or pylon temple built directly against its eastern face. This chapel was the focal point for the funerary cult of the deceased ruler, the place where priests and family members would bring offerings and perform rituals to sustain their spirit in the afterlife. The walls of these chapels were often adorned with vibrant painted reliefs depicting the deceased king or queen before the gods. Osiris, Isis, Anubis, as well as Amun and Epidamok making frequent appearances, making offering scenes of their earthly triumphs or aspects of the funerary journey itself. These reliefs, along with funerary stelae inscribed in Meroitic hieroglyphs or cursive script, are invaluable, if often frustratingly difficult to fully interpret sources for understanding Kushite religious beliefs, royal ideology, and artistic styles. The actual burial of the ruler was not within the pyramid structure itself, as was the case with some of the Old Kingdom Egyptian pyramids. Instead, the Kushite pyramids served as monumental markers built over subterranean burial chambers. These chambers, often consisting of 2 or 3 rooms, were cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. It was here deep underground that the mummified body of the king or queen would be laid to rest, surrounded by a wealth of funerary goods deemed necessary or desirable for their existence in the afterlife. And what an existence they prepared for. The Kushites, like the Egyptians, clearly believed in a vibrant continuation of life after death. The burial chambers of their rulers were often lavishly equipped. Excavations of those tombs, not entirely plundered in antiquity, or alas by more recent treasure hunters, have revealed an array of rich grave goods. Exquisite gold jewelry necklaces, earrings, bracelets, rings often inlaid with semi-precious stones like carnelian lapis, lazuli and amazonite ceremonial weapons, bronze swords, daggers, quivers of arrows, fine pottery, both the beautiful locally produced Meroitic painted ware and imported luxury ceramics from the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Elegant glassware, bronze vessels, wooden furniture beds, chests, stools, and sometimes even board games for whiling away eternity. Packing for the Kushite afterlife was clearly a very serious and probably rather expensive business. Okay, Your Majesty. The royal undertaker might be imagined to say, consulting a long papyrus, or perhaps Meroitic inscribed leather checklist. Have we got your best gold earrings depicting the ram of Amun check? Your favorite ceremonial lion-slaying spear, just in case of unruly afterlife lions check. Enough sacred beer and dried dates to see you comfortably through the first few millennia of eternity, double check. And most importantly, did anyone remember to pack the tiny, exquisitely crafted clay model of your most prized, slightly bad-tempered but incredibly fertile zebu bull? Mr. Snuggles. One simply cannot embark upon the great journey to the blessed western lands without Mr. Snuggles. The practice of mummification learned from Egypt was also adopted by the Kushites to preserve the bodies of their elite for the afterlife. Though the techniques and elaborateness may have varied over time and perhaps differed in some local customs from purely Egyptian methods. Sacrificed animals, particularly cattle and horses, were also sometimes included in or near the tomb, and in the earlier Napatan period. And with echoes back to Kerma, the unsettling practice of retainer sacrifice where servants or officials were killed to accompany their ruler in death did persist for a time, though it seems to have largely died out by the Meroitic era, replaced perhaps by Shabtai-like figurines or symbolic representations. The precise theological reasons behind the Kushite adoption and then very distinct stylistic modification of the pyramid form for their royal burials, and the exact extent to which their specific afterlife beliefs and funerary cosmology mirrored or significantly diverged from contemporary Egyptian concepts, particularly during the later Meroitic period. With its stronger emphasis on indigenous deities are complex questions that scholars continue to investigate. Relying on detailed analysis of tomb architecture, the iconography of chapel reliefs, the nature of grave goods, and the still very limited textual information gleaned from Meroitic funerary stelae and offering tables. A particularly unfortunate, quirky, and rather infamous tidbit in the history of exploring these Meroitic pyramids is the destructive activity of the Italian treasure hunter Giuseppe Ferlini in the 1830s. Driven by rumors of immense golden hoards, Ferlini, with a distinct lack of archaeological finesse, decided that the quickest way to access the presumed treasures within the pyramids was not through careful excavation, but with the judicious application of gunpowder. He rather callously blew the tops off several pyramids at Meroe, including most famously that of the wealthy ruling queen Amenemhotep. While he did indeed discover a spectacular hoard of exquisite gold jewelry from her tomb, much of which now resides in museums in Berlin and Munich, his methods caused irreparable damage to these ancient monuments. The ghosts of Meroitic queens, one imagines, were probably collectively face-palming from the afterlife and muttering, "Dude, there was a perfectly good, if slightly hidden, offering chapel door right there on the eastern side. Did you even try the door before resorting to explosives?" Honestly, the lack of basic decorum in some 19th century treasure hunters? These steep-sided Meroitic pyramids, standing in their silent, sun-drenched rows in the Nubian desert, are powerful, enigmatic symbols of Kushite royal power, their unique cultural identity, and their profound beliefs about death and eternity. They represent a fascinating chapter in the long history of pyramid building in the Nile Valley. A distinctively Kushite architectural statement, a final pointed assertion of their enduring place in the story of ancient Africa. The imposing steep-sided pyramids of Meroe, Egeria, with their attached offering chapels adorned with vibrant reliefs of kings, queens, and lion-headed gods, now fade into the shimmering desert haze of our sleepy imaginings. You've contemplated the Kushite journey into eternity, their unique expressions of royal power, and their profound beliefs about the afterlife. We've walked through the incense-filled halls of their grand temples, glimpsed the daily rites performed by their powerful priesthood, and marveled at their syncretic pantheon that so skillfully blended Egyptian majesty with fierce Nubian spirit. But what about life outside the palace, the temple and the tomb? What was the everyday existence like for the ordinary farmers, artisans, merchants, and families who formed the backbone of this remarkable ancient kingdom by the Nile? Let us now try to catch a few fleeting, precious glimpses into the daily rhythms and routines of Kushite society. A mainstream historical fact is that the economy of the Kingdom of Kush, like that of its northern neighbor Egypt, was overwhelmingly based on agriculture, all nourished and sustained by the life-giving waters of the Nile River. The annual inundation, though perhaps less extensive and predictable in Nubia than in parts of Egypt, still brought fertile silt and moisture to the narrow riverbanks, allowing for the cultivation of essential crops. Imagine yourself Egeria as a Kushite farmer, your skin burnished dark by the African sun, your hands calloused from working the rich black earth. Your life would be intimately tied to the rhythms of the river and the seasons. You would be planting and harvesting crops like sorghum and millet, hardy grains well suited to the climate, as well as barley, wheat, dates from the palm groves that fringe the Nile, various vegetables, and perhaps even cotton, as Kush was also known for its textile production. Farming in Kush was all about that essential Nile life. You carefully prepare your fields, After the flood recedes, you diligently plant your precious sorghum seeds. You pray that the local hippopotamus population doesn't develop a sudden insatiable craving for your prize-winning patch of unusually large melons. And then you offer fervent thanks to the great lion god Appodamak, or perhaps a local river deity for a bountiful harvest. And of course, you'd also hope for slightly fewer, surprisingly aggressive sacred baboons attempting to raid your meticulously tended date palms just as they're perfectly ripe. Irrigation would have been crucial, especially in areas further from the immediate floodplain. The Kushites would have employed techniques like the shaduf, a counterweighted lever for lifting water, and particularly in the later Meroitic period, the sakya, or animal-driven water wheel, to bring Nile water to their fields. Animal husbandry was also vital. They raised cattle often depicted in their art, with impressive lyre-shaped horns, sheep and goats, which provided not just meat and milk, but also hides, wool, and animal power for plowing. Fishing in the Nile, teeming with perch catfish and tilapia, would have provided another important source of protein for the daily diet. Beyond the agricultural heartland, Kushite society was home to a wide range of skilled artisans. We've already touched upon the mastery of the Meroitic ironworkers, whose smelteries produced tools and weapons. But there were also potters creating that distinctive and often beautifully painted Meroitic ware. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that even the everyday Kushite pottery, not just the elite funerary vessels, was often remarkably well made and aesthetically pleasing, decorated with lively geometric patterns. Stylized animals like giraffes or frogs, or trailing vine motifs suggesting a strong, widespread artistic sense that permeated many levels of their society. There were weavers producing cotton and woolen textiles, bead makers crafting intricate jewelry from faience carnelian and imported glass, tanners preparing leather, and bronzesmiths creating tools, weapons, and decorative items. Your typical Kushite artisan's day one imagines might involve waking up at dawn, offering a quick prayer to Amun that you haven't been unexpectedly selected for retainer sacrifice by a recently deceased royal. A concern more for earlier periods, thankfully. Then heading off to your bustling workshop where you might expertly craft some incredibly beautiful thin-walled pottery with delightful painted frog motifs, or perhaps forge a rather pointy and highly effective iron spearhead. Later, you might engage in some spirited haggling with a visiting Egyptian or Aksumite merchant who seems to think that Nubian gold literally grows on the local acacia trees and should therefore be acquired for next to nothing. Finally, you'd trudge home for a well-earned bowl of millet porridge and a refreshing mug of sorghum beer. It's a living, as they say, even in the Bronze and Iron Ages. The precise social organization and daily living conditions of the non-elite Kushite populations, particularly those residing in the smaller rural villages and agricultural settlements, situated away from the major urban and religious centers like Napata or Meroe, are generally less well understood than those of the royalty priesthood and urban elite, as archaeological evidence from such smaller, often less monumental, sites is frequently less well preserved or has not been as extensively excavated and studied, requiring scholars to carefully reconstruct the patterns of ordinary life from more limited data sets and cautious analogies. What did a typical Kushite home look like for these ordinary folk? In the cities, houses were often built of red-baked brick or stone, sometimes multi-storied with flat roofs and perhaps internal courtyards for light and air, all laid out along those surprisingly well-ordered streets we've noted in cities like Meroe. In rural areas, dwellings might be simpler, perhaps made of sun-dried mud brick or wattle and daub, with thatched roofs similar in form to traditional Nubian houses that have persisted for centuries. The household, the oikos, or its Kushite equivalent, would be the fundamental social and economic unit. Here the family lived, worked, and worshipped their own household deities and ancestral spirits. The daily tasks would involve the women grinding grain on stone querns preparing food. The average Kushite dinner probably wasn't a lavish 10-course royal banquet featuring roasted ostrich and gold-dusted figs, but more likely a hearty and nutritious bowl of sorghum or millet porridge, perhaps some grilled Nile perch if the fishing was good, a side of cooked lentils or beans, and a refreshing mug of home-brewed slightly sour sorghum beer, all accompanied by a lively family debate about whose turn it is to go down to the river and scare the sacred but increasingly bold baboons out of the date palms again. Delicious and highly entertaining fetching water from the Nile, or a local well caring for children, and of course the endless vital task of spinning thread and weaving textiles for the family's needs. What about leisure and community life? While the Meroitic script remains largely undeciphered, denying us their literature, we can imagine that storytelling music lyres, harps, drums, and flutes are depicted in their art or found in burials and dance, played important roles in their social and religious life, just as in most cultures. Local festivals perhaps tied to the agricultural cycle. The rhythms of the Nile or the veneration of local deities would have provided occasions for communal celebration feasting and a temporary respite from the daily grind. The marketplaces bustling with local produce and traded goods would also have been important social hubs, places to exchange news and gossip as well as commodities. The social structure likely included various strata, from the ruling elite royalty, high priests, top officials, wealthy merchants down to the farmers and artisans, and at the bottom, a significant population of enslaved individuals acquired through warfare or debt who perform much of the heavy labor in agriculture, mining, construction, and domestic service. Our understanding of their specific customs and any peculiar punishments related to maintaining this social order is again hampered by the silence of their texts, but the very existence of such a structured society implies a system of laws and norms. However unwritten or unreadable to us, they may be that governed daily interactions and managed disputes. The Nile's bounty sustained them, their gods watched over them. They hoped, and life in Kush, for all its ancient mysteries, was a vibrant tapestry woven from the threads of hard work, family ties, communal celebration, and a unique African cultural identity by the banks of the great river. You've now glimpsed into the imagined daily lives of the ordinary Kushite people of Egeria, the farmers toiling in the fertile Nile silts, the artisans skillfully shaping clay and metal in their bustling workshops, the families going about their routines within the baked brick or mud-thatched homes of ancient Nubia. We've considered the structure of their households, the importance of their agricultural bounty, and the communal rhythms that likely shaped their existence. But beyond the practicalities of daily sustenance and social order, how did these ancient Kushites express their identity, their status, their aesthetic sensibilities? A vibrant and revealing answer lies in their rich tradition of personal adornment, their unique artistic style, and the often breathtaking craftsmanship evident in the objects they created and cherished. The Kushites, it seems, had a distinct flair for fashion bronze and Iron Age style. A mainstream historical fact is that the Kingdom of Kush, particularly during its prosperous Napatan and Meroitic periods, was renowned for its sophisticated craftsmanship and a rich tradition of personal adornment, especially in the art of goldsmithing. Nubia itself was known to the ancient Egyptians as Ta Seti, the land of the bow, referring to their skilled archers, but also crucially as a primary source of gold. This precious metal mined from the deserts east of the Nile flowed abundantly through Kushite society. At least among its elite, and their artisans became masters at working it into exquisite jewelry and a dazzling array of decorative objects. The ancient Kushites, it appears, didn't really do subtle understatement when it came to their personal bling. We're talking gold earrings that might occasionally graze your shoulders, necklaces so broad and intricately detailed they could probably double as small, very fashionable defensive shields in a pinch, and enough carnelian faience and lapis lazuli beads to pave a miniature royal driveway from the palace to the main Amun temple. They weren't just casually wearing jewelry. They were often wearing a significant portion of their family's investment portfolio and looking absolutely fabulous while doing it. Imagine yourself, Egeria, perusing the adornments of a high-status Kushite man or woman. Gold would be everywhere. Heavy gold earrings, often large hoops or intricate pendant styles, were worn by both sexes. Broad collars reminiscent of Egyptian styles, but often with unique Kushite motifs, would encircle the neck. Bracelets and armlets of gold, sometimes inlaid with colorful stones, or faience adorned wrists and upper arms. Finger rings, some simple bands. Others bearing carved scarabs or divine symbols would gleam on their hands. Pectoral ornaments, elaborate chest pieces featuring images of gods or protective symbols hung from beaded necklaces. And amulets, tiny potent charms, i.e. made of gold faience, or semi-precious stones depicting deities like Bes the dwarf god, a popular protector of households and children borrowed from Egypt, but beloved in Kush. The ram of Amun, or the lion of Apetamak, would be worn for both decoration and spiritual protection. Ivory, another precious commodity, traded northwards from deeper within Africa through Kush, was skillfully carved into delicate ornaments. decorative inlays for furniture handles for mirrors or ceremonial fans and small cosmetic containers. Ebony wood with its rich dark beauty was similarly prized, and semi-precious stones brought color and vibrancy to their adornments. Carnelian with its warm reddish-orange hues was a favorite for beads and inlays. Lapis lazuli. That deep celestial blue stone had to be imported at great expense from distant Afghanistan, its presence a clear marker of wealth and long-distance trade connections. Amazonite, a beautiful green feldspar found more locally in the eastern desert, and amethyst with its regal purple were also popular. And faience, that wonderful ancient ceramic material that could be glazed in brilliant blues, greens, and yellows, was used to create countless beads, amulets, and small decorative objects. What makes Kushite style so fascinating is its unique blend of influences, creating something truly distinctive. There are undeniable echoes of Egyptian art and iconography, a legacy of centuries of close contact, political interchange, and shared religious devotion to deities like Amun and Isis. You'll see Ankh symbols, scarab beetles, depictions of Egyptian gods in relatively traditional forms. But alongside these, and increasingly so during the Meroitic period, indigenous Nubian artistic traditions and African motifs assert themselves with growing confidence. The powerful imagery of the lion representing the native god Ap-Demak and royal strength becomes very prominent. Local animals, desert flora, and perhaps more abstract geometric patterns drawn from African artistic repertoires begin to feature more strongly. Depictions of human figures, while sometimes adopting pharaonic postures or regalia, often show distinctly Kushite features. Darker skin tones when color is preserved, fuller lips, different styles of dress, and unique forms of scarification or body marking. If some interpretations of reliefs are correct, the precise origins and symbolic meanings of certain unique Meroitic jewelry motifs or specific recurring elements of their royal regalia, and the extent to which these represent purely indigenous Kushite artistic innovations versus being subtle adaptations or clever reinterpretations of Egyptian contemporary Hellenistic or even more distant sub-Saharan African stylistic influences, continue to be fascinating subjects of art historical research and ongoing cross-cultural interpretation. Royal regalia, of course, was particularly magnificent. Kushite kings and queens. The powerful kandakes were adorned with elaborate crowns, not always the familiar double crown of Egypt, but sometimes unique Kushite forms like close-fitting cap crowns, often featuring multiple uraei cobras or elaborate headdresses, incorporating ostrich feathers, sun discs, and ram's horns associated with Amun. The treasures recovered from royal Meroitic tombs, such as the spectacular gold jewelry of Queen Amanishakheto, before the aforementioned Giuseppe Ferlini got a bit too enthusiastic with his dynamite, that is a test to the incredible wealth and artistry at the disposal of the Kushite rulers. These pieces are masterpieces of goldsmithing featuring intricate granulation. Tiny spheres of gold fused to a surface, delicate filigree work, and vibrant inlays of enamel or semi-precious stones. A Kushite kandake, getting fully kitted out for a major state occasion or a particularly important religious festival, probably needed a dedicated team of highly skilled royal attendants just to manage her magnificent headdress, which likely involved several pounds of meticulously worked gold, an entire flock's worth of ethically sourced ostrich feathers, and possibly for extra divine oomph, a small live and very well-behaved sacred ram perched elegantly on top. It was a look that unequivocally stated, "I am powerful, I am divine, I am incredibly wealthy, and yes, my neck muscles are truly exceptionally well developed from years of wearing this glorious, if somewhat gravitationally challenging headgear." Even everyday objects often displayed a strong aesthetic sense. The Meroitic painted pottery we touched upon earlier, with its fine cream or buff slip, decorated with lively designs in red, brown, and black, geometric patterns, bands of ankas or lotus flowers, processions of animals like giraffes, ostriches, or frogs, and trailing vine motifs, was not just utilitarian. It brought beauty and cultural identity into the daily lives of many Kushites. You're drinking your morning sorghum beer or your evening Nile water out of a beautifully crafted pottery cup that's adorned with a charming frieze of slightly surprised-looking giraffes nibbling on acacia leaves, or perhaps some very stylish and mysterious geometric symbols that might, for all you know, be the Meroitic equivalent of a particularly profound philosophical statement about the interconnectedness of all things. It certainly makes your plain, unadorned, modern coffee mug look positively uninspired and spiritually bereft in comparison. The Kushites clearly believed that even basic hydration should be a deeply aesthetic and culturally significant experience. A quirky or fringe tidbit regarding personal adornment is that some Meroitic reliefs and statues appear to depict figures with elaborate patterns of scarification on their faces or bodies. While direct archaeological confirmation of this practice on actual human remains from Kush is rare, the artistic representation suggests that ritual scarification or other forms of body modification might have been a significant aspect of Kushite personal identity status or ethnic marking a tradition with deep roots in many African cultures. The Kushite style, then? Egeria was a vibrant, eclectic, and confident expression of a unique African civilization, one that skillfully wove together threads from pharaonic Egypt, the Hellenistic world with which it increasingly traded, and its own deep indigenous Nubian roots, all set against the backdrop of the gold-rich deserts and the life-giving Nile. Their love of rich materials, bold designs, and meaningful symbols tells us of a people who valued beauty, understood power, and adorned their lives and their afterlives with a distinctive and enduring artistry. You've now adorned yourself, Egeria, at least in your imagination, with the dazzling gold jewelry and unique stylistic flourishes of ancient Kushite fashion. You've pictured the vibrant painted pottery that graced their homes and the intricate textiles that clothed their bodies. We've glimpsed the daily lives of Kushite farmers by the fertile Nile and the skilled artisans in the bustling workshops of Meroe. But a society as complex, as urbanized, and as enduring as the Kingdom of Kush, with its powerful rulers, its grand temples, and its extensive trade networks, could not have functioned smoothly without a framework of rules, a system of justice, and mechanisms for maintaining social order. So how was law and order actually upheld in Meroitic society? What happened when someone stepped out of line here once again? We brush up against the tantalizing, frustrating silence of that largely undeciphered Meroitic script, forcing us to ponder how justice might have been conceived and administered, perhaps through divinely sanctioned laws whose exact wording now eludes us. A mainstream historical fact is that while no comprehensive Meroitic law code, akin to Hammurabi's famous stele or the detailed Hittite law tablets, has yet been discovered or deciphered, the very existence of a complex, socially stratified urban civilization, like that of Kush, strongly implies the presence of a sophisticated legal and administrative system. Such a system would have been essential to regulate commerce, manage property and inheritance, adjudicate disputes, and maintain public order within its cities and across its territories. This legal framework was likely influenced by a combination of deeply rooted indigenous Nubian customary laws, centuries of interaction with Egyptian legal concepts, especially during the Napatan period and the 25th dynasty, and specific royal decrees issued by the reigning Kushite kings and Kandiks. Imagine Meroitic law school Egeria if such a formal institution existed. The curriculum would be fascinating and probably incredibly challenging. Exam question number 1 might be: discuss the precise legal ramifications according to both divine precedent and royal edict of a sacred temple ram, accidentally or perhaps not so accidentally consuming your grumpy neighbor's prize-winning patch of particularly succulent sorghum. You must cite at least 3 relevant but unfortunately largely undeciphered Meroitic hieroglyphic inscriptions, provide 2 supporting omens as interpreted by a certified priest of Epidemic, and ensure your answer is neatly inscribed on a somewhat damp clay tablet using only a slightly frayed reed stylus. Good luck, and may Amun guide your hand. It must have been tough, especially the hieroglyph part, if you were more of a Meroitic cursive kind of aspiring legal scribe. In the absence of a readable law code, how do we even begin about to understand their concepts of justice and order? We look for clues. The very orderliness of cities like Meroe, with their planned streets, distinct zones for temples, palaces, and residential areas, hints at an underlying administrative and legal structure capable of organizing and regulating urban life. Royal inscriptions, even if only partially understood, often speak of the king or queen as upholders of justice, protectors of the weak and punishers of wrongdoing, echoing the common tropes of divine kingship found throughout the ancient Near East and Egypt. The concept of Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic order, truth, balance, and justice, which the pharaoh was responsible for maintaining, likely had its Kushite equivalent, a divine order that the ruler was divinely appointed to preserve. Laws, therefore, would have been seen not just as human conventions, but as reflections of this sacred cosmic order, given or at least sanctioned by the gods. If you broke a really important law in ancient Kush, it wasn't just the local constabulary. If they had one that resembled our idea of it that you had to worry about, it was the great gods themselves. Oh, you brazenly stole a particularly sacred temple fig. Did you? The mighty lion god Apetamak is not amused. And trust me, Ageria, you do not want to see Apetamak when he's not amused. It generally involves a lot of divine roaring, a distinct possibility of being smitten with a sacred spear, and absolutely no chance of a plea bargain. It's highly probable that Kushite law, like its Egyptian and Mesopotamian counterparts, distinguished between different types of offenses: crimes against the gods or the state, like sacrilege, treason, or offenses against the royal family, and crimes between individuals like theft, assault, or disputes over property and contracts. The former would likely have incurred the most severe penalties, often involving divine retribution or direct royal justice. For the latter, a system of local courts or councils of elders, perhaps operating under the authority of royal officials or temple priests, might have adjudicated disputes and imposed customary or royally decreed penalties. The precise nature of the Meroitic legal system, whether it was primarily based on largely unwritten orally transmitted customary law, administered by local authorities and community elders, or if there indeed existed more extensively codified royal laws, inscribed on now-lost perishable materials like papyrus or leather, or perhaps on monumental stelae or temple walls whose Meroitic inscriptions we cannot yet fully comprehend. And the exact extent of lingering Egyptian legal influence versus purely indigenous Nubian legal traditions during the Meroitic period remains a significant and challenging area of ongoing research and scholarly speculation, heavily constrained by the limitations imposed by the available largely undeciphered textual evidence. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some of the thousands of Meroitic ostraca inscribed pottery sherds or pieces of graffiti that have been found contain very short Meroitic inscriptions. While many are funerary epitaphs or simple dedications, it's tantalizingly possible that some of these brief texts might be abbreviated. Legal notes, records of minor transactions, markers of property boundaries, or even jotted down judicial decisions or reminders. It's like finding a single incredibly cryptic Bronze Age sticky note, presumably left on an ancient lawyer's desk, saying something like, "Re-stolen goat. C. Witness B offering to Apetamak overdue." Frustratingly brief, but hinting at a world of legal process. Archaeologists and linguists are still diligently sifting through all this fragmentary evidence, hoping one day to find the great lost Meroitic code of everything, probably inscribed on a magnificent gold-plated papyrus scroll hidden deep inside a secret chamber within a Meroitic pyramid, guarded by clockwork lion statues and a very complex riddle written in an even more obscure dialect of Meroitic. Or more realistically, they're hoping for just a few more broken potsherds with slightly clearer inscriptions like, "Buyer beware, this chariot has seen better days," or "Warning, attempting to pay your taxes with counterfeit ostrich feathers is a divinely sanctioned offense, punishable by having to listen to Uncle Nebmoknen's endless stories about his youthful exploits as a third assistant royal fan-bearer." What we can infer with some confidence is that justice in Meroitic society, like order itself, was likely seen as flowing from the divine realm through the sacred person of the king or queen and down through the various administrative and religious structures of the kingdom. Maintaining this divine law, this societal harmony, was crucial for the well-being of Kush, for ensuring the favor of the gods, the fertility of the land, and the prosperity of its people. And when this order was breached, when customs were violated, the system would have had its ways, some perhaps familiar, others undoubtedly peculiar to our eyes, of dealing with the wrongdoers. The grand temples of Kush, with their imposing pylons and shadowy incense-filled sanctuaries, have given you a profound sense, Ageria, of a society deeply connected to its gods, a kingdom where divine will is interpreted by powerful priests and sacred rulers, likely permeated every aspect of life, including the very framework of law and order. You've pondered how this Meroitic society, with its bustling cities, its intricate trade networks, and its unique blend of African and Egyptian cultures, might have maintained social cohesion and dealt with those who stepped outside the accepted norms. Now we must turn our sleepy, speculative gaze towards the less savory but undeniably crucial other side of the legal coin. The punishment's sting. the ways in which Kushite society might have dealt with its wrongdoers, and the peculiar punishments that might have been meted out in this ancient Nilotic realm. As we've established, the unfortunate silence of the largely undeciphered Meroitic script means we don't have a handy Kushite code of Hammurabi, or a detailed Meroitic manual of misdemeanors and their correspondingly unpleasant consequences to consult directly. We can't just look up Clause 37 subsection B to see what happened if you, say, accidentally offended a sacred ram, or were caught pilfering particularly high-quality incense from a temple storeroom. Therefore, our exploration of Kushite punishments must by necessity be a cautious one, piecing together clues from comparative ancient law, looking at their Egyptian and Near Eastern neighbors, interpreting archaeological finds. Though these rarely scream, "This was a specific punishment," and carefully sifting through the odd and tantalizing, sometimes frustratingly vague and occasionally rather sensationalized accounts of classical Greek and Roman writers who commented on the customs of the Ethiopians, a term often encompassing Nubians, Kushites. A mainstream historical fact is that while the specifics of the Kushite penal system remain largely unknown due to this lack of deciphered legal text, comparative evidence from other contemporaneous ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian societies, along with logical inferences from Kushite royal iconography, which often depicts kings and queens in dominant postures, smiting enemies or receiving tribute, all implying a capacity to enforce authority, suggests that their range of punishments would likely have included fines, forms of corporal punishment, periods of forced labor, exile, and for the most severe offenses, capital punishment. The ruler, the kor, or kandake would have held ultimate judicial authority and the power of life and death. Let's consider some common categories of crime and how a Kushite wrongdoer might have faced the sting of justice. For theft, a common offense in any society, the punishment would likely vary depending on what was stolen and from whom. Stealing from a temple or royal property would almost certainly incur a far harsher penalty than, say, pilfering a neighbor's slightly overripe figs. Fines, often calculated as a multiple of the value of the stolen goods, and restitution to the victim were common principles in ancient Near Eastern law, and were likely employed in Kush. For repeat offenders, or for more significant thefts, perhaps some form of corporal punishment, branding, or even enslavement for debt if the fine couldn't be paid, might have been possibilities. What about crimes of violence, like assault or accidental injury? Again, drawing parallels, compensation payments to the injured party or their family? The amount often carefully calibrated according to the social status of both the victim and the offender, and the severity of the injury would be a probable solution. While Egypt, for instance, had laws that sometimes prescribed an eye for certain offenses, the general trend in some other ancient Near Eastern codes, like the Hittite laws we explored in another Sleepy Journey, often lean towards financial compensation, rather than purely retaliatory physical punishment, at least between social equals. Whether Kush followed more of an Egyptian model or a compensatory one for such interpersonal violence is something we can only ponder. Homicide, of course, would be treated with utmost seriousness. Intentional murder, especially of a kinsman or a high-status individual, would almost certainly be a capital offense. Unintentional killing might be dealt with through the payment of a substantial blood money or wergild to the victim's family, a practice designed to prevent endless cycles of blood feuds between kin groups, though such feuds might still have occurred in areas where state control was less firm. Offenses against the gods, the temples or sacred rituals, acts of sacrilege, would have been viewed with particular horror, as these were believed to endanger the entire community by provoking divine wrath, potentially leading to famine, plague, or military disaster. Punishments for such crimes were likely very severe, possibly involving exemplary public execution, purification rituals for the community, and heavy fines or confiscation of property to appease the offended deities. If you were caught, for example, trying to make a cheeky personal amulet out of a chipped piece of Epidamac's sacred lion statue, you probably wouldn't just get a slap on the wrist and a stern telling off. It would be more like a fast-track ticket to a very public, very unpleasant, and divinely sanctioned "Do not offend the extremely powerful lion god again ever" educational seminar, likely with a rather permanent and non-negotiable final exam. The extent to which the Kushite legal system may have relied on forms of corporal punishments, like mutilation such as the cutting off of a hand for theft, or the nose for certain sexual offenses, which were certainly present in some contemporaneous ancient Near Eastern law codes like Hammurabi's or Middle Assyrian laws versus perhaps favoring fines, compensation, enslavement, or other forms of social sanction, is exceptionally difficult to determine definitively from the current archaeological and the very limited, undeciphered textual evidence available from Kush itself, leaving reconstructions of their specific penal practices largely inferential and open to scholarly debate. Now for the peculiar punishments, those that might strike us as particularly unusual or reflective of unique Kushite beliefs. While hard evidence is scarce, we can speculate. A quirky or fringe tidbit often comes from those classical Greek and Roman writers who, when describing the Ethiopians, again often meaning Kushites, or other Nubian peoples, sometimes recounted exotic or extreme customs. For instance, Diodorus Siculus, writing about the earlier Napatan period, famously claimed that the priests of Amun held such power that they could order the king to commit suicide if the oracle declared it was the god's will and the king would obey. While the historical accuracy of this specific claim is highly debated. And as we noted, a later king named Ergomenes supposedly put a rather firm stop to this particular priestly prerogative by having the priests executed. Instead, it hints at a society where divine command and religious law could at times hold ultimate sway even over the monarch. Could similar divinely ordained, or perhaps just deeply traditional and unusual punishments have been applied to commoners for certain transgressions? Perhaps. Given the reverence for animals in Kushite iconography, were there specific punishments related to harming sacred animals, like the rams of Amun, or creatures associated with Apatamak? Or conversely, could animals themselves have been used in punishments? The idea of being thrown to the crocodiles is a rather lurid punishment, sometimes attributed by classical writers to exotic southern lands like Egypt or Nubia. Whether this was a genuine Kushite judicial practice or just a thrillingly gruesome piece of traveler's tale hyperbole is impossible to say for sure, but it certainly qualifies as peculiar if it did occur. Exile banishment to the harsh desert wastes beyond the fertile Nile Valley would also have been a severe punishment, effectively a death sentence for many. The enforcement of these punishments would likely have been carried out by royal officials, temple guards, or perhaps even by the community itself in cases of locally adjudicated customary law. The king or queen, as the ultimate judicial authority, would have had the final say in capital cases or appeals. You can almost imagine the Meroitic legal system having a sort of customer service line for particularly tricky cases or appeals against overly enthusiastic local magistrates. Thank you for calling the Royal Court of Mero Justice Department. Your call is very important to us. Please hold while we consult the sacred entrails and the latest pronouncements from the Oracle of Apatamak. For punishments involving light smiting, press 1. For ritual purification followed by exile to a slightly less desirable oasis, press 2. If you've accidentally offended a Kandake, we recommend you just start running now and don't stop until you reach Punt. The sting of punishment in ancient Kush, whether through fines that could ruin a family corporal, means that left a permanent mark exile that severed all social ties or the ultimate penalty of death, served not just to penalize the individual wrongdoer, but to reaffirm the social order to appease the gods and to act as a powerful deterrent to others. The exact forms it took may remain largely hidden beneath the sands of Nubia and the silence of Meroitic script. But the underlying human need for justice order and a way to deal with those who broke the sacred rules of the community was undoubtedly as potent there as in any other ancient civilization. We can only hope that future archaeological discoveries or a breakthrough in deciphering their language will one day allow us to read their law codes directly, and perhaps discover that some of their punishments were indeed quite peculiar, while others might seem surprisingly familiar. Perhaps we'll even find a few very elaborate cuneiform parking tickets complete with detailed instructions on how to pay your fine in measures of barley or appropriately apologetic sacred baboon figurines. Penalty for leaving your war chariot unattended in a designated sacred grove during the annual Feast of the Nile. Inundation, 3 goats, 2 jars of the second best beer, and a very sincere public apology to the head priest's prize-winning, and now slightly inconvenienced, ceremonial ostrich. You've now had a rather sobering, if largely inferred, glimpse into how the ancient kingdom of Kush might have dealt with its wrongdoers, Egeria. We've imagined a system where divine law, royal authority, and communal custom likely intertwined to deliver justice with penalties, ranging from fines and restitution to perhaps more severe corporal punishments, or even death for the gravest offenses. But what happened when guilt was uncertain, when evidence was scarce or contradictory, when human judgment faltered in the face of a difficult case? In many ancient societies, when faced with such intractable dilemmas, they turned to a rather dramatic, and to our modern sensibilities, deeply unsettling method of seeking truth and divine verdict, the trial by ordeal. Could such strange justice methods, as our outline ominously hints, have formed part of the Kushite judicial customs? A trial by ordeal. Egeria is essentially a practice where the guilt or innocence of an accused person is determined not by human deliberation over evidence, but by subjecting them to a painful, dangerous, or physically challenging test, the outcome of which is believed to be directly controlled or revealed by divine intervention. If the accused successfully endures the ordeal, or if their wounds heal in a particular way, or if some other miraculous sign occurs, they are deemed innocent, protected by the gods. If they fail, suffer greatly, or perish, their guilt is considered divinely proven. It's a system that places the ultimate burden of judgment squarely in the hands or claws or fiery breath of the supernatural. Now, did the ancient Kushites of Meroe and Napata actually practice trial by ordeal? A mainstream historical fact is that while trial by ordeal was indeed a known judicial practice in various ancient and medieval societies across the globe, from medieval Europe with its ordeals of hot iron or boiling water, to parts of ancient India and Africa, direct, unambiguous evidence for its specific forms and widespread prevalence within the Kingdom of Kush is currently lacking. Our old friend, the undeciphered Meroitic script, once again veils their precise legal procedures from us. We have no Kushite law codes that explicitly state if a man is accused of stealing his neighbor's prize-winning sacred melon and there are no reliable witnesses, he shall be required to retrieve said melon from the bottom of a pit filled with moderately annoyed scorpions. If he emerges unscratched and with the melon intact, he is clearly innocent and also very, very lucky. If not, well, the scorpions have delivered their verdict. However, the absence of direct proof doesn't entirely rule out the possibility. Given the Kushites' deep religiosity, their belief in the active intervention of gods like Amun and Apidamak in human affairs, as seen in the oracular selection of kings, for example, and the prevalence of ordeal practices in some neighboring or culturally linked societies. Certain forms of oracular justice or divine testing were known in ancient Egypt, and various ordeal systems were widespread in many traditional African cultures historically. It's not entirely implausible that some form of ordeal might have been occasionally resorted to in Kush, particularly for crimes that were hard to prove or that carried heavy spiritual pollution. So if we allow our sleepy imaginations to drift into the realm of what if, what kind of peculiar ordeals might have existed in ancient Kush? The title of this section playfully suggests ordeal by crocodile. And indeed, the Nile crocodile, a formidable and often terrifying presence in their riverine world, was a creature both feared and in some contexts, particularly in parts of Egypt, even revered or associated with specific deities like Sobek. Could a Kushite community faced with an intractable accusation have resorted to throwing the accused into a sacred crocodile-infested stretch of the Nile? The logic would be simple if brutal if the crocodiles devoured you. Well, clearly the river god, or the crocodiles themselves, acting as divine agents, deemed you guilty. If by some miracle you were spared or managed to escape, you were obviously innocent and divinely protected. And also probably in dire need of a very stiff drink of sorghum beer and a complete change of loincloth. While this makes for a wonderfully dramatic and rather exotic image, and classical Greek writers certainly love to recount such sensational tales about distant barbaric peoples, we must emphasize that there is no direct evidence to suggest this was a standard Kushite judicial practice. It remains firmly in the realm of lurid if entertaining speculation. Other, perhaps slightly less toothy forms of ordeal known from other cultures might also be considered. The ordeal by fire, where the accused had to walk over hot coals, carry a red-hot piece of iron for a certain distance, or retrieve an object from boiling water, was common in medieval Europe. If their burns healed cleanly and quickly, it was a sign of innocence. The ordeal by poison, where the accused ingested a controlled amount of a specific toxic substance, with survival indicating divine protection, was known in some African and other traditional societies. The extent to which formal trial by ordeal, as distinct from more common oracular divination practices or priestly judgment, might have formed a significant or regular part of the Kushite judicial system is highly speculative, as there is currently no direct archaeological evidence such as specific ritual sites or implements clearly identifiable with ordeals, or clearly interpretable textual evidence from either Meroe or Napata to definitively confirm such practices. This forces any consideration of them to rely on much broader comparative anthropological studies of judicial mechanisms in traditional African or other ancient societies, and on a very cautious reading of often unreliable classical ethnographic accounts of Ethiopian customs. The underlying logic of trial by ordeal, however peculiar or irrational it seems to us Egeria, was from the perspective of those who practiced it often quite compelling. In a world where divine forces were believed to be constantly active and all-powerful, it made a certain kind of sense to appeal directly to those forces for a definitive judgment when human means failed. It provided a sense of certainty, however terrifying, in an uncertain world. It could also act as a powerful psychological deterrent against both committing crimes and making false accusations, as the prospect of undergoing a painful and potentially lethal ordeal was not one to be taken lightly. The beauty of trial by ordeal from the perspective of the perhaps slightly overworked human judges is that it really takes the pressure off them to make the final call. Was he guilty of stealing those sacred ostrich feathers? I honestly don't know. The witness statements are a complete mess and everyone seems to be related to everyone else. Let's just see if he spontaneously combusts when he attempts to touch this particularly sacred and conveniently very hot rock. If he does well, the gods have clearly spoken. And also, we're going to need a new sacred hot rock for next week's difficult perjury case. Case closed. Next, a quirky or fringe tidbit from medieval Europe which echoes some of the strange logic of ordeals was the ordeal of cold water. The accused, often suspected of witchcraft, would be bound and thrown into a body of water that had been blessed. If they floated, they were considered guilty, as the pure consecrated water was seen as rejecting them. If they sank and were one-hopes quickly pulled out before drowning, they were deemed innocent. The logic is often wonderfully, if rather terrifyingly baffling to modern sensibilities, but it underscores the deep belief in divine intervention in such judgments. So while we cannot definitively say that a Kushite accused of a crime would find themselves facing a grumpy crocodile as their judge and jury, the possibility that some form of ordeal, some appeal to direct divine judgment, through physical trial existed within their legal customs remains an intriguing if unproven speculation. It adds another layer of mystery to this powerful African kingdom, a society that sought order and justice through means that were undoubtedly shaped by their own unique worldview, their own powerful gods, and the often harsh realities of life by the ancient Nile. If you were accused of a crime in Kushite and the evidence was unclear, you might find yourself hoping very, very hard that the local judicial system favored lengthy legal arguments and witness testimony over, say, a swimming test in a particularly murky, reptile-rich section of the river. You've now peered Egeria into the shadowy, often unsettling realm of Kushite justice, contemplating how this ancient Nubian kingdom might have dealt with its wrongdoers, and even speculated on the rather dramatic, if unproven possibility of trials by ordeal involving sacred crocodiles or other divinely controlled tests. The overarching picture is one of a society that, despite the frustrating silence of its undeciphered Meroitic script, clearly possessed a system for maintaining order. A system likely rooted in divine sanction and royal authority. But when we speak of royal authority in Kush, particularly in its later Meroitic period, we encounter one of its most fascinating, distinctive, and to contemporary Greco-Roman observers, rather peculiar customs, the remarkable power and prominence of its female rulers, the formidable Kandakes. The title Kandaki, or Kantake as it appears in Meroitic inscriptions, is a term that has echoed down through history, largely thanks to its Hellenized form Candace, used by Greek and Roman writers like Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and Cassius Dio when describing the powerful queens of what they had often termed Ethiopia, meaning Kush, or Meroe. This was not merely the title for an ordinary queen consort, the wife of a reigning king. While the Kandake often referred to the hugely influential queen mother, who, as we've touched upon, likely played a crucial role in royal succession and perhaps even acted as regent for young sons, it also crucially appears to have been the title used by or for a series of women who ruled the kingdom of Kush as independent sovereigns. as queens regnant in their own right. So, in Kush, you didn't just have kings meticulously managing the flow of gold and negotiating with grumpy lion gods. You had these incredibly powerful Kandakes who could, and often did, lead armies into battle, dictate state policy, oversee vast construction projects, and generally ensure that the kingdom ran smoothly, all while probably rocking some truly spectacular royal headdresses. Talk about multitasking on an imperial scale, dude. A mainstream historical fact is that the Kingdom of Kush, particularly during its vibrant Meroitic period, roughly 300 BCE to 350 CE, was notable for the exceptionally high status and significant political power accorded to its royal women. Several women bearing the title or name Kandake are known from historical accounts and archaeological evidence to have ruled as independent sovereigns, wielding considerable political, military, and religious authority, a situation that often astonished and intrigued their Greco-Roman contemporaries. What evidence do we have for these ruling queens? The classical writers provide some of our most vivid, if sometimes perhaps slightly sensationalized accounts. Strabo, for example, writing in the late 1st century BCE, early 1st century CE, famously describes a fierce, one-eyed Candace who led her Kushite forces in a war against the Roman legions in Egypt during the reign of Emperor Augustus in the 20s BCE. This Kandake, often identified by modern scholars with Queen Amanirenas, not only resisted the Roman advance, but actually launched a counterattack sacking Roman-held cities in southern Egypt, including Aswan Sayin and Elephantine, and even carrying off statues of Augustus himself. Imagine being a highly trained, battle-hardened Roman legionary used to conquering vast swaths of the known world, and you suddenly find yourself facing a determined Nubian army led by a formidable warrior queen who is clearly not in the least bit intimidated by the might of Rome, and who, by the way, only has one eye, which probably makes her look even more intimidating. You'd likely think, right then, perhaps our esteemed Emperor Augustus might be open to some diplomatic negotiations, maybe a nice gift of locally sourced Roman olive oil and a polite agreement to redraw the border slightly further north before this remarkably fierce lady decides to use my legionary helmet as a decorative flower pot for her palace gardens. The eventual peace treaty, remarkably, was rather favorable to Kush with Rome, withdrawing its claims to certain territories and establishing a fixed border. This encounter certainly left an impression on the Romans. Archaeological evidence from Meroe and other Kushite sites powerfully corroborates the high status and ruling power of these queens. Their names and images appear in temple reliefs where they are depicted in full royal regalia, sometimes shown smiting enemies in the classic pharaonic pose, making offerings to gods like Amun, or a Padamak, or even ruling jointly with a king who might be their son or husband. They were buried in their own steep-sided pyramids in the royal cemeteries of Meroe tombs that were often as richly furnished as those of the kings, filled with gold jewelry, imported luxury goods, and symbols of their authority. Queens like Shanaktakete, possibly the earliest known ruling queen of Meroe, perhaps dating to the 2nd or 1st century BCE, Amenishaketo, whose plundered treasures are now in European museums, and a monitor who appears in partnership with King Natakamani. On many temple reliefs engaged in extensive building projects were clearly figures of immense power and prestige. The precise nature of the Kandake's power within the Meroitic political system, whether certain women consistently ruled as fully independent sovereigns in their own name, or more commonly as regents for underage sons, or perhaps as influential co-rulers alongside a male king, be it a husband or son, and the exact mechanisms and ideological justifications by which they attained and successfully wielded their considerable authority, are still subjects of ongoing nuanced research and lively discussion among specialists in Nubian studies. The interpretation often relies on careful analysis of complex iconographic details like who is shown in the primary position on a relief. The limited information from Meroitic inscriptions accompanying these scenes and the sometimes ambiguous accounts of classical authors who may not have fully understood the intricacies of Kushite royal succession or gender roles. The prominence of these powerful Kandakes is frequently cited as strong evidence for significant matrilineal elements within Kushite royal succession and societal structure. While the kingship itself might not have passed exclusively through the female line in all cases, the position of the Queen Mother was clearly of paramount importance. Her lineage, her status, and her influence could be crucial in determining which of her sons, or perhaps even other male relatives, was considered eligible or was ultimately chosen for the throne, especially if the oracles of Amun were involved. And in some instances, it seems these powerful royal women simply bypassed the male candidates altogether and took the reins of power themselves. While women in some other contemporary ancient societies like Greece or Rome were often busy with their domestic duties, perhaps dabbling in a bit of polite poetry and generally trying not to have too many overtly public opinions, the Kandaks of Kush were out there ruling vast kingdoms, commanding armies, commissioning monumental architecture, and generally being exceptionally awesome and powerful heads of state. This phenomenon of powerful ruling queens in an African kingdom certainly intrigued and sometimes bewildered their Greco-Roman observers, for whom such direct female political authority was a rarity, often associated with barbarian or exotic lands. It challenged their own patriarchal norms and expectations. The Kandaks of Kush thus became almost legendary figures in classical literature symbols of a distant, wealthy, and sometimes rather formidable southern realm, where women could and did hold ultimate power. Their story is a vital reminder of the diverse forms of political organization and the varied roles of women in the ancient world. A powerful counter-narrative to assumptions of universal patriarchy. These were not just queens by marriage. They were often rulers by right, by tradition, and by the sheer force of their own formidable personalities and political acumen. You've now stood in awe at Jeria before the imagined power and majesty of the Kushite Kandakes, those formidable ruling queens and queen mothers of Meroe who held sway over a vibrant African kingdom, commanded armies, and left their indelible mark on the monumental architecture of the Nile Valley. We've journeyed through their temples, speculated on their laws, and glimpsed the daily lives of their people. Yet throughout this entire sleepy exploration of curious Kushite customs and peculiar punishments, there has been a constant, almost palpable presence accompanying us, a profound, tantalizing, and often rather frustrating silence. This silence emanates from one of the most significant and most enigmatic legacies of the Meroitic period. Their unique written script, a code that despite decades of scholarly effort remains largely uncracked, guarding so many of Kush's deepest secrets from our modern understanding. A mainstream historical fact is that the Kingdom of Kush, during its later Meroitic period, roughly from the 2nd or 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE, developed and used its own distinctive writing system known as Meroitic. This was a remarkable achievement, a clear assertion of cultural independence from their northern Egyptian neighbors whose hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts had long been dominant in the Nile Valley. The Meroitic script actually existed in two forms: a more formal hieroglyphic version derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but adapted to write the Meroitic language, which was primarily used for monumental inscriptions on temples and royal stelae, and a much more common cursive script, flowing and elegant, which was used for a wider range of everyday purposes, from funerary texts and dedications to perhaps administrative records or even personal letters, though few of these more ephemeral documents have survived. The Meroitic script is like that incredibly cool, very exclusive ancient treasure chest you finally managed to locate after years of searching, only to discover it's locked with a fiendishly complex, magically enchanted combination lock, and the only clue left behind is a rather cryptic note that just says, hint. Try vowels, but not too many, and definitely not on a Tuesday if Mars is in retrograde. Scholars have been diligently trying vowels consonants. Statistical analyses, comparative linguistics, and possibly even some light academically sanctioned interpretive dance for the better part of a century, and the script for the most part continues to give them the Sphinx-like silent treatment. Now, it's not that we know nothing about it. Thanks to the brilliant pioneering work of scholars like the British Egyptologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith in the early 20th century, who famously used bilingual inscriptions, often funerary offering tables with parallel texts in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Meroitic, and the recognizable names of kings, queens, and gods that appeared in both Egyptian and Meroitic forms. The phonetic values of most of the 23 signs that make up the Meroitic alphabet, it was largely alphabetic, with a few syllabic signs, which was a significant innovation, have been successfully deciphered. We can therefore often read Meroitic inscriptions in the sense of sounding out the words. The profound challenge, the great uncracked mystery, lies in the Meroitic language itself. We don't fully understand its grammar, its vocabulary, its linguistic affiliations. The precise linguistic affiliation of the Meroitic language remains one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in the field of African historical linguistics and ancient studies. With various hypotheses over the decades proposing potential connections to language families such as Nilo-Saharan, particularly the Eastern Sudanic branch, Afro-Asiatic, or other language isolates. But as of now, none of these theories has achieved definitive proof or widespread scholarly consensus, thereby significantly hampering comprehensive decipherment efforts beyond a basic understanding of names, titles, some kinship terms, and certain formulaic expressions found in funerary text. Without a known related language to provide cognates and grammatical parallels, essentially without a Meroitic Rosetta Stone, the meaning of most Meroitic words in the full sense of their text remains stubbornly obscure. And what secrets does this beautiful, enigmatic script continue to guard so closely? Almost certainly the very details we've been so eagerly, if speculatively exploring throughout our sleepy journey, Ageria. Imagine if we could read their texts fluently. We might finally have their own detailed law codes spelling out those peculiar punishments and curious customs with unambiguous clarity. We might discover their historical annals, their own narratives of their kings, queens, and Candaces, their victories and defeats, their interactions with Egypt, Rome, and Axum, all told from their own Kushite perspective. We might uncover their religious texts, their hymns to Apedemak and Amun, their myths of creation, their beliefs about the afterlife, the precise invocations used in their temple rituals or by their oracles. We might even find their literature, their poetry, their stories, perhaps even personal letters revealing the everyday thoughts, hopes, and anxieties of ordinary Meroitic people. It's like knowing there's an entire library filled with fascinating books, but they're all written in a language you can only sound out phonetically, leaving you to guess at the meaning of every single sentence. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that, while we have over 1,000 known Meroitic texts, the vast overwhelming majority of them are very, very short. Most are funerary stelae, or offering tables typically containing the name and parentage of the deceased. Perhaps a few titles and a basic invocation to Isis and Osiris for a good afterlife. These funerary formulas, often borrowing Egyptian concepts, are some of the better understood parts of Meroitic. It's a bit like trying to understand the entirety of, say, 21st century English-speaking civilization, based solely on a vast collection of tombstones and a few thousand very brief, slightly formal office memos or email subject lines. You'd get a lot of names, a sense of hierarchy, some common phrases, but you'd miss almost all of the nuance, the literature, the philosophy, the everyday conversation, the jokes. Imagine future archaeologists trying to reconstruct our entire complex society based only on a million RIP Great-Aunt Mildred gone but not forgotten. Facebook posts and a pile of corporate re-urgent TPS reports, email headers. The ongoing efforts to decipher Meroitic are a testament to scholarly dedication and the enduring human desire to connect with the past. Researchers meticulously analyze sign frequencies. Grammatical patterns compare Meroitic with various African language groups and search for any new bilingual texts that might provide further clues. Every small breakthrough, every newly understood word or grammatical feature is a cause for quiet celebration in the esoteric world of Meroitic studies. So, as you contemplate the Kingdom of Kush area, remember that its story is one told not just through its impressive pyramids, its golden treasures, and its powerful rulers, but also through this profound, frustrating, and deeply alluring silence of its uncracked script. The Meroitic mysteries are still very much alive, locked within those elegant cursive loops and formal hieroglyphic signs. We can see they were a literate people, a people who recorded their world in writing. But until we can fully understand their words, a significant part of their unique worldview, their curious customs and their peculiar punishments, will remain tantalizingly just beyond our reach, whispered only on the desert winds that sweep across the ancient sands of Nubia. Imagine if we finally definitively deciphered all those Meroitic inscriptions. We're all hoping for epic poems about lion gods, profound philosophical insights on the nature of existence, and perhaps the secret to eternal youth hidden in a Candace's royal decree. But knowing our luck, they probably mostly say things like, King Natakamani was here October 10th, approximately 1 AD, had a fairly decent barley beer. Or please do not forget to offer a suitably plump sacrificial goat to the great god Apedemak next Tuesday. His divine mood has been a bit off lately. Or perhaps even the Meroitic equivalent of warning the royal crocodiles are feeling particularly peckish this afternoon. Kindly refrain from dangling any tempting limbs over the sacred riverbank until further notice. The mundane mixed with the magnificent just like any other civilization. Word count 1399. The enigmatic symbols of the Meroitic script, Aguria, those elegant unread whispers from the heart of ancient Kush, now begin to fade into the soft darkness, carrying with them their closely guarded secrets of a civilization both powerful and profoundly mysterious. We have journeyed along the Nile from the early days of Kerma through the glory of the Black Pharaohs and into the iron-rich, independent era of Meroe, a kingdom that carved its own unique path, blending African spirit with Nilotic tradition. We've marveled at their steep pyramids, imagined their bustling cities, and stood in awe before their lion-headed gods and formidable ruling Kandaks. Yet for all our sleepy explorations into their curious customs and peculiar punishments, the full rich texture of their inner life, their laws, their literature, their deepest beliefs remains tantalizingly veiled by the silence of their lost language. The story of Kush is a powerful reminder that history is not just a collection of grand monuments and royal deeds, but also a tapestry woven from words from the voices of ordinary people and their leaders. And when those words are lost to us, a vital part of their humanity remains just beyond our reach. As the sands of Nubia gently settle over our thoughts, may you find a peaceful appreciation for these ancient peoples, for their enduring monuments, and for the profound mysteries they still hold. And may your own dreams be filled with clear understanding, with deciphered secrets, and with the quiet wisdom that comes from listening to the faintest echoes of the distant past. The beautiful, intricate, yet stubbornly silent Meroitic script Egeria has left us with a profound sense of the mysteries still held by the ancient kingdom of Kush. We can admire the artistry of their inscriptions, sound out the names of their kings and Kandakes, and recognize the invocations to their powerful gods like Amun and Apidamak. But the full richness of their history, their laws, their literature, their peculiar customs and punishments, as they themselves recorded them, remains tantalizingly just beyond our linguistic grasp. We've journeyed through the zenith of Meroitic power, with its flourishing iron industry, its extensive trade networks, and its unique cultural identity. But all empires, however mighty, eventually face the tides of change and the winds of decline. And so, our sleepy narrative must now turn towards the fading light of this once great African kingdom to witness the eventual weakening of Meroe and the gradual disappearance of this remarkable civilization from the stage of ancient history. The Meroitic kingdom of Kush, which had flourished for centuries as a beacon of indigenous African power and sophistication along the Middle Nile, began to experience a period of gradual decline from roughly the 3rd century CE onwards. This wasn't a single dramatic collapse, no sudden cataclysm that wiped Meroe off the map overnight. It was more like a slow, complex unraveling, a fading of strength and influence over decades, even centuries, driven by a confluence of internal pressures and mounting external threats. Even mighty kingdoms, it seems, Egeria can have their oops, did we perhaps leave the imperial stove burning a little too brightly for too long, and inadvertently use up all the sacred acacia wood charcoal needed for smelting the royal iron for the entire next millennium kind of moments? Meroe's decline wasn't a sudden, explosive, game over thanks for playing. It was more akin to a slow, dignified, if somewhat melancholic fade-out, perhaps with slightly less impressive and rather more sparsely attended pyramids being constructed each succeeding year. What were the internal factors that might have contributed to this weakening? While the specifics are, as always with Kush, somewhat obscured by the lack of detailed textual records, we can infer some possibilities. Succession struggles, even with their unique system possibly involving oracles and influential queen mothers, could still have led to periods of internal instability or weaker leadership if the transitions weren't smooth. The immense resources required to maintain the state, cults build monumental temples and pyramids, and support a royal court and administration might have over time strained the kingdom's economy. Environmental factors could also have played a significant and perhaps underestimated role. The intensive iron smelting for which Meroe was so famous required vast quantities of charcoal, which in turn necessitated the felling of extensive acacia woodlands in the surrounding Butana steppe. Over centuries, this could have led to significant deforestation, soil erosion, and desertification impacting agricultural productivity and the availability of essential resources. The precise weight and interplay of various contributing factors, leading to the gradual decline and eventual collapse of the Meroitic kingdom. Whether primarily due to long-term environmental degradation and resource depletion increasing, internal political instability and succession crises. The disruptive rise of powerful new neighboring states like Aksum growing pressure from aggressive nomadic groups on its frontiers. A fundamental shift in lucrative long-distance trade routes that bypassed Meroitic territory or a complex interlocking combination of all these elements remains a subject of ongoing research, vigorous debate, and diverse scholarly interpretation among historians and archaeologists specializing in ancient Nubia. Externally, the pressures were certainly mounting. To the southeast in the highlands of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, the powerful kingdom of Aksum was rising as a major commercial and military force. Aksum, with its access to Red Sea trade routes, became a significant rival to Meroe for control of the lucrative trade in ivory, gold, incense, and other African goods destined for the Roman Empire and beyond. It's like having a very new, very ambitious, and incredibly well-connected neighbor suddenly move into your previously quite exclusive cul-de-sac, who then immediately starts hosting much cooler, more internationally attended parties, and somehow manages to get significantly better access to all the really good Red Sea shipping lanes. It was undoubtedly rather awkward and increasingly problematic for Kush's long-standing regional economic dominance. A mainstream historical fact is that the Meroitic Kingdom of Kush faced increasing pressure from this rising Aksumite power. The most dramatic evidence of this comes from a famous inscription left by King Ezana of Aksum in the mid-4th century CE. In this text, Ezana records a major military campaign deep into Kushite territory, claiming to have defeated Kushite forces sacked towns along the Nile, possibly including Meroe itself, or at least seriously disrupting its environs and effectively brought an end to any remaining centralized Meroitic authority, though the kingdom was likely already in a state of severe decline by this point. Adding to Kush's woes were increasing incursions from nomadic peoples living in the deserts to the east and west of the Nile Valley groups, often referred to in classical and later texts as the Blemis and the Nobatai or Noba. These hardy desert warriors, perhaps driven by their own population pressures or environmental changes, began to raid Kushite settlements, disrupt trade caravans, and even establish their own independent power bases within former Kushite territories, particularly in Lower Nubia. The once secure borders of Kush became increasingly porous and difficult to defend. Even their relationship with Roman Egypt to the north, while often one of trade, could shift. As the Roman Empire itself faced its own internal crises and external threats in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, its ability or willingness to maintain stable frontiers and engage in consistent long-distance trade with Meroe may have fluctuated further, impacting Kushite economic prosperity. The archaeological evidence from Meroe and other late Kushite sites paints a picture of this gradual fading. There is a noticeable decline in the scale and quality of monumental building. The construction of royal pyramids continues for a time, but they become smaller, less richly endowed. Imported luxury goods become scarcer in later tombs. Some settlements show signs of abandonment or by abandonment or destruction. The unique Meroitic script, that beautiful alphabetic system they had developed, gradually falls out of use eventually to be replaced by Greek and Coptic in the Christian Nubian kingdoms that would later emerge. The Meroitic script just sort of peters out. It's like the Kushites, after centuries of diligently inscribing their funerary stelae and temple dedications, collectively decided one afternoon, you know what, this whole carving 23 distinct and rather fiddly signs onto hard sandstone business is really quite a lot of effort, isn't it? Perhaps for future important communications, we should just go back to a system of very expressive grunting, some interpretive dance, and maybe just pointing at things a lot. Not really, of course, but the eventual cessation of its use and our subsequent inability to fully read it is a bit of a cultural tragedy. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that one of the very last known datable Meroitic inscriptions comes not from the heartland of Meroe itself, but from much further north at Kalabsha in Lower Nubia. It's an inscription by a king named Karamadoye dating to the mid-5th century CE, well after the presumed collapse of the central Meroitic state. This suggests that Meroitic language and culture and perhaps some form of Kushite political identity lingered on for a while in successor states or among Nubian groups even after the great capital city had lost its power. It's like finding a very, very late, slightly wistful email sent from the long-defunct email server of a once mighty corporation, a final faint digital echo of a bygone era. By around 350 CE, the Kingdom of Kush as a unified, powerful, centralized state with its capital at Meroe had effectively ceased to exist. Its territory fragmented, its unique Meroitic culture began to transform, and new peoples and new political entities started to emerge in the Nubian Nile Valley. The long, illustrious, and often enigmatic story of this great African kingdom was drawing to a close its fading power, leaving a void that would soon be filled by the rising Christian kingdoms of medieval Nubia. The once mighty kingdom of Kush Agaria, with its iron-rich capital at Meroe, its distinctive steep-sided pyramids, and its formidable ruling Kendates, has now in our sleepy narrative succumbed to the inexorable tides of history. We've witnessed its gradual decline pressured by internal frailties. Environmental shifts, the rising power of Axum to its southeast, and the increasing incursions of nomadic peoples along its frontiers. By the mid-4th century CE, the centralized Meroitic state had effectively collapsed its great cities, slowly yielding to the encroaching sands, its unique script fading into an enigmatic silence. It might seem at first glance like the end of the story. Another magnificent ancient civilization vanishing almost without a trace, destined to become a mere footnote in the grand annals of world history, largely overshadowed by its more famous northern neighbor Egypt. But the legacy of Kush, though often overlooked, is far more resilient and enduring than that. Its whispers Egeria can still be heard on the desert winds blowing across the sands of ancient Nubia. For centuries, its true Kush was like that incredibly cool, historically significant, and slightly mysterious indie band that never quite hit the mainstream global charts because everyone was understandably completely mesmerized by the stadium-filling rock anthems and colossal pyrotechnic stage shows of their much louder, more famous, and media-savvy northern neighbor Egypt. But now, thanks to the patient work of archaeologists, historians, and linguists, Kush is finally getting its overdue greatest hits of ancient Nubia more than just pyramids. Though our pyramids are also very pointy and interesting. Compilation released to a wider appreciative audience. A mainstream historical fact is that although the Meroitic kingdom of Kush disintegrated as a centralized political entity by around 350 to 400 CE, its profound cultural and demographic legacy did not simply evaporate. Instead, it contributed significantly to the formation and character of the subsequent Christian Nubian kingdoms, Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia, which flourished in the very same territories along the Nile Valley for nearly another 1,000 years, from roughly the 6th to the 15th centuries CE. The people of Kush didn't just vanish. Their descendants became the Nubians of the medieval period, adopting Christianity but also retaining and adapting many older cultural substrata. The precise extent and the exact mechanisms of cultural transmission from the pagan Meroitic kingdom to these later Christian Nubian kingdoms, particularly in complex areas such as political ideology, subtle artistic motifs, underlying social structures, and perhaps even certain folk religious beliefs that may have been syncretized with Christian practices, remain actively debated and meticulously researched by scholars, as they seek to understand the intricate continuities and profound transformations across this pivotal period in the long arc of Nubian history. But the connections are there. Some Meroitic architectural forms, decorative styles in pottery, or even aspects of royal iconography seem to find echoes, however transformed, in the art and culture of Christian Nubia. A quirky or fringe tidbit, for instance, is that the powerful ram-headed iconography of the god Amun, so prominent in Kush, especially at Jebel Barkal and Napata, continued to appear in some surprising early Christian Nubian contexts, sometimes subtly syncretized or reinterpreted. The ram, a symbol of divine power and procreative force for Amun, could, for example, be visually assimilated or perhaps even consciously re-envisioned in a Christian context to sometimes symbolize Christ as the Lamb of God, or other Christian allegorical figures, creating a fascinating visual and symbolic bridge between the pagan Kushite past and the Christian Nubian future. The Meroitic language, while it ceased to be written in its unique script, did not disappear overnight. It likely lingered as a spoken vernacular in some areas for a considerable time, and some scholars search for its potential influence on Old Nubian, the Nilo-Saharan language, that became the written tongue using a Coptic-derived alphabet of the Christian Nubian kingdoms. The Kushites left behind their amazing legacy, those steep pyramids, their exquisite gold jewelry, their powerful images of Candaces, and of course that beautifully unique written language that we still for the most part can't definitively read. It's as if they meticulously threw an epic, historically significant party, took thousands of incredibly detailed photographs, wrote wonderfully evocative and detailed captions for every single one, and then with a knowing wink saved them all in a highly proprietary, long obsolete file format that no modern supercomputer, no matter how advanced, can successfully open. So close and yet so tantalizingly, frustratingly far from full comprehension. Beyond Nubia itself, Kush's wider impact on Africa is also a subject of great interest. Meroe, as we've seen, was one of the earliest and most significant centers for iron smelting in sub-Saharan Africa. The knowledge of ironworking and the stronger tools and weapons it provided would have been a transformative technology. It's highly probable that this technology, perhaps along with Meroitic traders or migrating artisans, gradually diffused southwards and westwards from Kush into other parts of the African continent, contributing to significant cultural and economic developments far beyond the Nile Valley. Furthermore, the extensive trade routes that Kush helped to establish and maintain connecting the Mediterranean world via Egypt and the Red Sea with the resources of Inner Africa, gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animal products, did not simply vanish with the fall of Meroe. These ancient commercial arteries continued to function in various forms and under different controllers for centuries, shaping the economic and cultural interactions of northeastern Africa. Perhaps one of the most enduring, if less tangible, legacies of Kush is its very existence as a powerful, sophisticated indigenous African civilization that flourished for millennia, creating monumental architecture, developing its own script, and at one point even ruling over its mighty neighbor Egypt. The rediscovery of Kush in the 19th and 20th centuries by European and American archaeologists and explorers was and continues to be immensely important for a more balanced and nuanced understanding of ancient African history, challenging older, often Eurocentric narratives that tended to downplay or ignore the achievements of sub-Saharan civilizations. Kush stands as a proud testament to indigenous African innovation, resilience, and cultural richness. The kingdom of Kush might have eventually faded from the main stage of world power, its cities slowly succumbing to the sands, but its story is a powerful example of a historical comeback in our modern understanding. Lost or largely forgotten by the wider world for many, many centuries, it has been gradually rediscovered, painstaking piece by archaeologists and historians. And now it's like Kush is finally stepping back into the historical spotlight and saying with a dignified, if slightly dusty inclination of its royal ram-adorned headdress, "Ahem! Excuse me, rest of the world, just a friendly reminder, remember me. The other major, incredibly ancient pyramid-building civilization on the Nile." Yes, that one. Turns out I was also pretty awesome, and my story is well worth knowing. And it absolutely unequivocally was and is. So as the whispers of Meroitic names and the imagined sounds of Kushite life finally fade into the gentle embrace of oncoming sleep, Egeria, we are left with a profound sense of wonder for this often overlooked kingdom. Its full story may still be partially veiled by the silence of its unread script and the shifting sands of the Nubian desert. But the legacy of its art, its power, and its unique cultural identity endures a potent reminder of the rich and diverse tapestry of ancient human civilization along the eternal Nile, the sands of Nubia. Egeria now gently swirl and settle, drawing a soft, dusty veil over the steep pyramids of Meroe, the grand temples of Amun and Apetamak, and the imagined marketplaces once bustling with Kushite life. Our long journey south along the Nile into the heart of this powerful and enigmatic African kingdom has reached its end. We have sought to uncover its curious customs, to ponder its peculiar punishments, and to understand how this remarkable civilization guarded and welcomed its new lives, even as so many of its deepest secrets remain locked away within its undeciphered script. From the early rise of Kerma, through the glory of the Black Pharaohs who ruled Egypt to the independent might and unique cultural flourishing of Meroe, with its formidable Kandakes, the kingdom of Kush, carved an indelible, if sometimes overlooked mark on the ancient world. Its people created distinctive art, mastered challenging technologies like ironworking, engaged in vast trade networks, and developed a complex society with its own rich religious and political traditions. The specific words of their laws, the precise intonations of their sacred chants, the exact recipes for their daily bread, these may be lost to us like whispers carried away on the desert wind. Yet the enduring human spirit that animated Kush, the desire for order, the reverence for the divine, the celebration of life, the protection of the vulnerable, the ambition of its rulers, and the everyday joys and sorrows of its people, these things resonate across the millennia. As you drift now into your own peaceful rest, may the echoes of this ancient Nilotic kingdom, with all its mysteries and its quiet strength, bring a sense of wonder and a gentle reminder of the vast, sound, rich, and often surprisingly interconnected tapestry of our shared human story.